Canada's auto sector is taking a direct hit.
I'm going to see a lot of my workers on the street, and it breaks my heart. I'm quite shocked by it.
The lives of Canadian auto workers are already being disrupted. We'll bring you some breaking news this morning on a temporary shutdown of a major Stellantis facility in Windsor. Canada escapes additional damage in Donald Trump's global trade war, but Ottawa looks set to keep up the pressure.
There's probably some room to add further retaliation because of the autos piece.
We'll soon know how Canada will respond. Prime Minister Mark Carney is set to address the country at 11:30 Eastern this morning. And disappointment and defiance from Trump's newest tariff targets.
If you take on one of us, you take on all of us.
How the countries being hit hardest are preparing to fight back. This morning, we have comprehensive coverage on U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. It is now a world trade war, but Canada's economy remains very much on the front line. As we look live at Washington and the White House, here's the epicenter of what amounts to an unprecedented economic earthquake. U.S. tariffs are now hitting 185 countries. And for Canada, there's a breaking development this morning. Damaging tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles are now in force, and we're seeing an immediate effect. As we begin our coverage looking at the Stellantis plant in Windsor, Ontario, the very city at the core of Canada's auto industry. The Stellantis plant is going on temporary shutdown for 2 weeks, effective this coming Monday. In a statement just out this morning, Stellantis confirms Trump's tariffs are a key reason. The automaker says plants in Mexico are also going into temporary shutdown, and that will have a knock-on effect for Stellantis operations in the U.S. Right now, all Canadian-made cars and light trucks crossing into the U.S. face 25% tariffs. That tariff hit is lower when there are more U.S.-made parts in the vehicles. Meeting the rules set out in the free trade agreement remains the key issue, both for automakers, for parts makers, and auto workers. Here's what a local union president in Windsor is telling us this morning.
I can see what Stellantis is doing is what Ford is probably doing, what GM is doing, is they got to start calling all their suppliers to say, hey, can you supply us? Your margins are so low, and now you'll end up being tariffed. Will you be able to support the parts for the engine, for example? I don't know how they'll be able to afford it. I don't know how anybody's going to be able to afford to buy a vehicle, to be quite frank with you. And I've always said this is not just going to impact Canadians in our industry. It's going to impact the Americans also.
More tariffs on the Canadian auto industry are set for May 3rd. That's the 25% on auto parts. But again, the size of the hit will be calculated based on the U.S. content in large components like engines, transmissions, and powertrains. There are tens of thousands of Canadians who work in this country's auto sector, either for parts makers or in car plants. There is one fear for the industry that isn't going to happen, and that's as a result of yesterday. We know the auto tariffs won't have a further reciprocal tariff stacked on top. But the union leader who represents auto workers tells David Cochrane on Power and Politics, Canadians shouldn't take much comfort from that.
We have a very big problem on our hands, David. We have tariffs on auto. We have tariffs on steel and aluminum. We have a decision that's going to be made on these border tariffs, and they have signaled that they are coming after our sectors one by one by one.
That is Lana Payne giving us a sense of where we stand on this morning after Trump's announcement. Canada isn't on the chart he's carrying here, showing the U.S. and the countries going to be targeted with reciprocal tariffs. The tariffs hitting those other countries are potentially staggering. 34% for China, 26% for India, 46% for Vietnam, one of many Asian countries being targeted and supply low-cost consumer goods to the U.S. Longtime American allies and trading partners like the UK, Europe, Japan, and South Korea, they are all taking tariff hits. And we're seeing worldwide reaction this morning, including in the fast-falling stock markets. Wall Street opens this hour, possibly with a view to calm investors. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who oversees the trade and tariff strategy, he is putting out a somewhat misleading message about the tariffs on Canada.
USMCA is still in place, so if you make a car in America and the parts are made in Canada or Mexico, there is no tariff. The auto parts business of Canada and Mexico are not being touched. Energy prices are not being touched.
Again, Lutnick there seeming to brush aside what we're getting from White House fact sheets, that auto tariffs are in fact in place and again will be calculated on the basis of non-U.S. parts in Canadian vehicles sold in the U.S. And any Canadian energy that does not meet the standards in the free trade agreement, they would be under a 10% tariff as well. Let's take you across the border to begin our coverage this morning. Megan Fitzpatrick is in Detroit, right in the downtown core of the city, which is right in the core of the auto industry for the United States. What are you hearing about auto tariffs there this morning, Megan?
Well, I'll first tell you what I'm seeing, Heather, because in downtown Detroit, everywhere I look right now, I'm surrounded by the auto industry. We're right beside a building that says it's the UAW Ford Joint Trust Center, the UAW being the United Auto Workers Union, of course. Over my shoulder here, that big office tower behind me is a GM building. So we are in the heart of Motor City, as Detroit is known, and this city bracing for impact as well from the tariffs. But there are sort of mixed feelings about tariffs. The UAW, for example, the union representing some of these auto workers here in this country, are in favor of the tariffs. Even at the news conference in the Rose Garden yesterday with President Donald Trump, a retired auto worker from the Detroit area speaking and cheering on the president as he announced these tariffs. But from other stakeholders in the industry, they are against these tariffs. They had lobbied the White House not to follow through, warning of how damaging the tariffs would be for the auto sector on this side of the border. And here in Michigan, Heather, 1 in 5 jobs are connected to the auto industry. And there's a lot of concern about how this will impact all the smaller companies that supply the big three, the big auto companies here in the United States. Groups that represent the auto industry, like the Detroit Regional Chamber and Mich Auto, another group, had lobbied the White House saying that these tariffs would increase costs for those small and medium-sized companies, increase costs for consumers. They're predicting that the cost of cars will go up, and that will translate to a drop in demand, and that will affect the production at the companies. And these companies are major drivers for this state. And so they are not happy about these tariffs being impacted, and those groups putting out a statement last night, now that they are going ahead, urging a renegotiation, a quick renegotiation of the free trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, saying the three countries should be working closely together so that they compete in what is a global auto market. We'll be doing an interview a little bit later this morning with a representative of that group, Mich Auto. In the meantime, yesterday, we interviewed a mayor from the Detroit area in Rochester Hills. He's a Republican mayor who has been speaking out against the tariffs. Like Drew Dilkins, the mayor of Windsor, just over there, I can see Windsor from where I'm standing, Heather. Mayor Brian Barnett also concerned about potential job losses for his community. Here's some of what he told us.
Higher tariffs mean higher prices, and that, of course, affects demand. Demand affects production, and production, ultimately, if you have less production, you need less workers. And so, ultimately, it could lead very quickly to job loss. And so, I think that's the biggest concern. A few days here and there may not affect prices that much, but, if we're waiting for jobs to repatriate back to the United States, that's a 24 to 36 month kind of process for most big companies. And if something's going to be on that long, I think you're going to see a lot of diminished production. And of course, that means jobs.
So he's saying he's trying to remain optimistic and hopeful that the governments can come to a resolution, the Canadian and the American governments, and quickly work something out, because he, like the mayor of Windsor, Heather, not happy about these tariffs.
Megan, you mentioned the prediction that car prices are going to go up, and go up significantly by thousands of dollars. What did you hear when you visited a car dealership there?
Yeah, there are varying predictions about how much more expensive cars could get for Americans in the months ahead. We visited a dealership in Dearborn, Michigan yesterday. The president of Village Ford dealership saying that he thinks these tariffs will have a negative impact on his business. He says the cars that he has right now on his lot, they're already there, so they're not subject to the tariffs, but it'll be the ones that arrive in the months ahead that will be the more expensive ones. He's not too concerned about a major impact to his business, though, you know, there are predictions of a possible recession because of these tariffs. That could impact the ability of Americans to buy cars. I asked one of the sales guys there if he thinks Americans are willing to pay more for cars, and he said they're not willing to walk to work or take public transit. He thinks they will still buy cars, even though they will be more expensive. But we also had discussions, Heather, about what's going on between our two countries right now. Detroit and Windsor are so closely linked, and as we know, a lot of Canadians have chosen not to travel to the U.S. right now. They're boycotting American products. So I talked to people at that dealership yesterday about that, and I wanted you to listen to what Jim Seavitt told me about the state of the relationship right now. Take a listen.
We have been neighbors, and I guess it feels a little like a marriage that they're separated. I hope they're not divorced, but it's very uncomfortable being on a border city like we are and being so connected in so many ways. I mean, our best trading partners are Mexico and Canada. So, you know, why do you go to war against them?
And speaking of marriage, he is married to a woman who grew up in Canada, Heather, so he knows our country well, and he says he understands the feelings of Canadians right now in terms of those Canadians that are choosing not to come to the United States right now. He understands it. And yeah, some of the people I was talking to say it's just kind of sad, the state of the relationship right now.
Megan, you're having interesting conversations. Thank you for telling us about them. Megan Fitzpatrick live in Detroit. As for Canada's response to these latest tariff moves, Mark Carney is expected to lay that out later this morning. He'll speak to reporters at 11:30 a.m. Eastern after he meets virtually with the country's premiers. That is set for next hour, set to begin at 10 a.m. Carney spoke briefly to reporters in Ottawa last evening, going into a meeting with members of his cabinet committee.
President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. There is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians.
Carney is off the campaign trail again this morning and acting in his role as Prime Minister. Again, he will meet with the premiers in about 45 minutes. 10 a.m. virtually. He will speak to Canadians at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and we will have full live coverage of that here on CBC News Network. In advance, Kate McKenna joins us live from Ottawa. It's going to be obviously based on those meetings, Kate, a key day, key decisions to come from the federal government. What response are we expecting, should we expect to see today?
Well, he's kind of put in the window that we can expect some sort of response on retaliatory measures for the auto tariffs that went into effect at midnight. So Mark Carney finds himself doing a bit of a balancing act, because on one hand, these auto tariffs are set to hurt Canadian jobs, but on the other hand, you know, there is a limit to how much Canada can retaliate without Canadians feeling it when they try to buy things. And also, it's probably not in Canada's best interest to aggravate the president and have him perhaps retaliate further. But officials have told us that they didn't know what Donald Trump was going to announce yesterday. So they find themselves reacting to the news at the same time that all of Canada was. He did have a meeting with his cabinet committee last night after Donald Trump made the announcement. He's meeting with the premiers in about an hour. Already, Canada has slapped about $60 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American goods. We know that there is another wave of up to $95 billion in potential American goods that they could target. Whether or not they'll do the whole thing remains to be seen. You know, they'll have to be proportional. You were speaking with Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey not long ago, and he called for a proportional, strong retaliatory plan, says he wants Canada to show a position of strength and force and to protect its auto workers. Here's more of what he said.
From my perspective, yesterday changed nothing. In fact, it made it a little bit worse in that it could have incredible impacts in the auto sector in Ontario. And if people and if families, if the industry in Ontario is hurting, if families are hurting in Ontario, then we hurt here in Newfoundland and Labrador too.
We know that the premiers have been very seized with what kind of worker support will be available for people who are affected by these tariffs. And we'll be waiting to see what exactly comes out of the premiers meeting on that, if that's something else that Mark Carney might be announcing later today. And of course, all of this is happening in the broader picture of an electoral campaign. So there are a number of party leaders out today, this hour, the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. The NDP have flagged that they have a major announcement within this hour, something that is going to address nation building in Canada, sort of their plan for dealing with the Trump tariff threat. Last night in Kingston, Pierre Poilievre held a rally. He addressed what Donald Trump did yesterday. Here's what he had to say.
After, for decades, workers on both sides of the border locked arms to build the greatest auto sector in the world, the president is betraying America's closest friend and attacking our economy, proving once again that Canada must end its era of overdependence and weakness. We must be an economic fortress that can defend itself, that can stand up for its own people and put Canada first.
So the tariff threat from Donald Trump was really the central focus of yesterday's campaign, the speeches from the opposition leaders, the comment from the Prime Minister. We can probably expect that again today.
Kate, thank you very much. Looking ahead with us from Ottawa is Kate McKenna. And next to Washington and looking live there, the White House in the Rose Garden. We had that scene yesterday with U.S. President Trump announcing his latest tariff targets. Canada was not on that list, but the tariff and trade war is now global in scope. And Katie Nicholson is in our bureau in Washington. Take us through the latest Trump thinking and what he announced yesterday.
Well, yesterday, President Donald Trump and those charts really upended the global economy. Today, his team is out there trying to defend the plan as markets plunge. Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary, she was calling this the golden age and saying that the more than 180 countries affected have been ripping off America for about 70 years and not really or struggling to directly answer questions about immediate concerns people have about cost of living. And Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick just on CNBC trying to keep the focus on what he says will be in the long-term and medium-term gains for the U.S. Here's a little bit of his responses to sort of what kind of a reaction he expects from other countries.
Stop picking on us. Stop saying that we can't sell our corn to India. Stop saying that we can't sell our beef anywhere. Just stop treating us so poorly if we are the great consumer of the earth. The United States buys everybody's products. We buy everybody's goods. You just have to treat us fairly.
And of course, the cheerleader in chief of this tariff plan, the President of the United States, put up on Truth Social, the operation is over, the patient lived and is healing. The prognosis is that the patient will be far stronger, bigger, better, and more resilient than ever before. Make America great again. So let's just revisit the Rose Garden announcement yesterday, right? So that was an across-the-board 10% tariff on imported goods. And some countries were dinged much harder, including allies in Europe and Asia. And this was really a broad array of penalties that were harsher than a lot of analysts had expected. And there are criticisms to just how haphazard some of them appear to be, almost as though this were a rush job. So one of the targets I would point you to is it's not even inhabited, right? It's the Heard and McDonald Islands near Antarctica. And to be clear, the only inhabitants there are penguins hit by a 10% tariff. And it would be very funny if this weren't so serious. So there's confusion, too, around the end game here. And how does this fit in with the administration's end goals? Is this, pardon me, a permanent economic policy? Or is this some sort of a temporary opening salvo for negotiations? losing my voice talking about this. And certainly that was the message that we heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent last night. He was urging other countries not to immediately retaliate. But businesses are here. They're very nervous. They were nervous yesterday. I went to an Italian restaurant, was talking to the staff. They import cheese, wine, now facing a 20% tariff. What happens to that money? Like, who has to absorb it within the restaurant? What is passed on to the consumer? And we are talking about a country, much like Canada, that is really concerned about cost of living and affordability. How is this going to go over, this plan, with Americans who are going to find out very quickly how this is going to hit them in the pocketbook?
Do not ever mind that, Katie. That happens to me all the time. So I appreciate it, Katie Nicholson, with that breaking news there in Washington. Now let's come back to Ottawa. Again, looking ahead, we're going to find out very soon, as Katie was saying, a number of things. But in Canada, we're going to find out what this country's government response is. Prime Minister Carney chairing next hour a virtual meeting with the premiers in terms of formalizing the ongoing tariff response and next moves. 10 o'clock that begins, and then Mark Carney will speak to reporters at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. We'll have it for you live on CBC News Network. Again, looking live at Parliament Hill. Party leaders today. Mark Carney is in Ottawa, but he's off the campaign trail this morning in his role as Prime Minister, meeting with the premiers and then speaking to reporters about Canada's tariff response at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh also in Ottawa. He's set to make an announcement later this morning on nation building, strengthen the economy, and we'll listen to that live on this program. We are just moments away, we think, from listening in to Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet in Quebec City. That's coming up. And we're going to hear from him as he talks about, again, Canada's tariff response, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre holding a news conference in Kingston, Ontario. The Green Party co-leader Jonathan Pedneau speaking about sovereignty. All of the major party leaders set to appear today in a very special program on Radio-Canada. 5 chefs, une élection. 5 leaders, 1 election. That's going to air this evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, on all Radio-Canada platforms. Let us look in on this election day, day 12. And Eric Grenier with me this morning, the founder of the Rit.ca. He's in charge of the CBC poll tracker. He's just released an updated version, and it's very interesting indeed. Good morning from Ottawa, Eric, and welcome back.
Good morning.
What's the latest trend for us on this day 12?
Well, we are seeing now that the Liberals have moved into a pretty solid position when it comes to where they are in the polls. In the poll tracker, we now have them around 43%. That's up about 3 points from where they were last week when we last chatted. The Conservatives have been holding steady. They're just under 38% support, and the NDP has slid back a little bit. They're currently at around 8% support. So that gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives of about 5 or 6 percentage points, because it is so strong across the country. We see a lead for the Liberals in British Columbia, Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and Quebec. We're now projecting that the Liberals would be able to win with these kinds of numbers around 200 seats, which is a huge shift from where things were when we were talking about them winning 40 seats at the beginning of the year. The Conservatives would win somewhere around 117 seats. The Bloc Québécois would win around 20, and the NDP somewhere in the single digits, it seems, based on where the numbers stand today.
That is the single digits. We were talking about that last week. Eric, I have so many more questions for you, but Yves-François Blanchet is about to start talking, and I have to break away from this conversation to bring in live coverage. Thank you for that. Poll Trackers online, and you can read Eric's latest analysis in the aggregate of the polls nationally. But let's, again, as I mentioned, let's take you to Quebec City. And there is the leader of the Bloc Québécois, Yves-François Blanchet, some of his candidates provincially. Let's listen in live.
Affecting aluminum, steel, the auto sector, and so on, which are not based on the spirit of CUSMA. That suggests a certain stability, at least until the end of the election campaign. But it also puts us in a state of mind where we would perhaps like to negotiate the future. And certainly the National Assembly of Quebec, and that's the reason why we're in Quebec City today, passed two motions, one which says that in the list of the U.S. parameters that would be trade irritants, well, Bill 101, the right to live in French, and the application of Bill 96, and it goes as far as an impact on the SAQ, supply management, culture and arts. So there are issues in there that are very targeted and that are particularly important to Quebec. The other motion from the National Assembly, which was initiated by the Parti Québécois but passed unanimously, says that Canada is not one economy, even though Mr. Carney says Canada is composed of 13 different economies, and one of the most important ones is Quebec's economy, which is distinctive and different from others. Now, obviously, U.S. tariffs have been hitting Quebec for quite some time in certain sectors of the economy. But that being in mind, our proposal, but this is now official, is that in the delegation to negotiate on behalf of Canada, there would need to be a Quebec presence, not a Quebec delegation, which would be different, and negotiate directly with Washington, no. But we want to be an ally in such negotiations, and an ally must be treated as an equal, so we're asking that the government of Quebec, and Mr. Legault is asking for the same thing, be able to choose the Quebec participants who will be part of the negotiation delegation in Washington. So that is what we are requesting, and there are a number of other measures that are worth repeating that could be brought in as well if they are supported by Parliament. In relation to the assault on the economy, we talked about a mirror legislation to Buy America, the Buy American Act, and this would also mean having Canadian content in what is being manufactured and produced, an effort to diversify markets, an effort to support the productivity of businesses, and the domestic processing of Quebec products. So that would mean formal participation for Quebec representatives. And I would add to that we have already said in the past that we are in favor, and we'll see what position Mr. Carney says, we are in favor of counter tariffs because there are still illegal tariffs being imposed, dollar for dollar, of course, but being careful to create exceptions for certain particularly vulnerable sectors. And I have heard from these sectors, agri-food, the aerospace sectors, and some sectors are very vulnerable because they buy parts and components from the United States. So I think we need to target rather than be making it a cross-Canada effort. But I think Canada must take action quickly, and we can easily identify certain things. The GDP and the population together are more significant than the American GDP. So there are some things that will be hard to tolerate across the U.S. economy. There will be, of course, inflation that's impossible to control, and of course an impact on Canada's and Quebec's economy as well. So I just want to reiterate my demand, and the Quebec government is asking the same, that they have the ability to choose the Quebec representatives, and I think it's important that Quebecers know that they can have some major control over future negotiations so that there's no deal without Quebec. That won't work based on the number of MPs chosen to represent the Bloc. In that case, we will have the balance of power, and as a moderate ally and partner, we can participate in these negotiations, but ensuring that there is no scenario where the Quebec economy will be sacrificed to please Mr. Trump. Thank you. Yes, sorry, that was a bit lengthy, but I had a lot of things to say.
Une question suivie par journaliste à des fins d'enregistrement, pardon. Merci de vous nommer ainsi que le média que vous représentez.
Bonjour à tous, Patrice Bergeron, La Presse canadienne.
La Presse canadienne.
Quand on parle de délégation,
you're talking about a delegation to negotiate, but that means a mandate. In your opinion, what should the mandate of the Quebec delegation look like? Well, certainly we understand that the United States will designate certain issues in a negotiation, and there's a contradiction, because when Mr. Trump says that he wants a quick negotiation, we understand that he wants it to be completed before the midterm elections next year, because then he might lose control of the House. So I certainly would like that to happen as well, because in that case, the Quebec election would be able to go forward without the issue of the negotiation. But we cannot put everything on the table. We cannot talk about all the sectors under CUSMA and deal with all of them at once, because normally the negotiation was to start in 2026, and we think it has to be done by 2026. So that means it would have to start as quickly as possible. So what will be on the table if they want it quick? That's problematic. If they want it to be sectoral, it might be shorter. And in the U.S. sectors, and that is why we want to protect Quebec, there will be arts and culture. There will be language issues, perhaps. Supply management, that's absolutely clear. And compared to what Mr. Champagne has been saying, the principle of supply management has never been attacked because it's still there. It's different parts being sacrificed each time. So we have to protect supply management as a whole. They say, oh, we only let go 4%, but that's not what we want to see happen. It has to be wholly protected. So if there are sectors that are mentioned specifically, and we're expecting the U.S. to target a lot of sectors in Quebec, that means that Quebec has to be guaranteed a voice around the table and kind of a veto. If the Bloc Québécois has the balance of power in the next Parliament, we will not agree to any treaty that would be against Quebec's interests. If it's okay for Quebec, we will make an attractive contribution to any negotiation. Since you're talking about timelines, a year or more, I'd like to know, yesterday you said you'd like to have a conversation with the current Prime Minister. Do you see any discussions with other party leaders as to how that delegation should be set up, when the negotiations should start, and so forth? Because you're saying it should start quite quickly. Well, I think what Mr. Trump announced yesterday gives us an opportunity to end or to finish our campaign in a normal manner. There could have been more more threats from the U.S. president that would be having us run right, left, and center. And perhaps Mr. Carney would withdraw from the campaign and not talk to anyone. But now that when we know what the composition of the next parliament is, I think the leader, the prime minister, will have to speak to the next leaders. And the timeline for negotiations with the U.S. has to be negotiated with them. We won't have control over that, but we would like it to be quick. Hello, Radio-Canada. In your proposal, you say that even in the talks on the tariffs, Quebec representation should be present. But Mr. Carney is speaking to all the premiers this morning. Mr. Legault is there. So what's the difference? What would a delegation bring? What could it contribute? Well, we answer that question every 3 days. Mr. Carney is trying to be elected as Prime Minister of Canada. He has not been elected yet. So for now, he's taking initiatives in relation to the U.S. or to the premiers of the provinces and Quebec, assuming that he will be Prime Minister of Canada. And that's the reason why he called Mr. Trump. He said, you know, if there's an election, don't worry, it'll be me. Now, we're talking about the federal parliament here that has not been composed yet because the campaign is not over. He cannot do things that he hasn't got the ability to do as prime minister. And we believe that in relation to the United States, after the election, there can be real negotiations. But there won't be any discussions on the tariffs per se. But we want to have our voice heard, but it's less formal in that case. And it won't be happening that much in the next weeks. Mr. Carney will bring in his countermeasures. He already knows what I think for the most part. I want to see the details of what he's going to announce. But the principles are already well known, even though they have choices to make in terms of certain exceptions. We're going to impose a dollar for dollar tariffs, perhaps not as high as we thought because the U.S. came in a bit less than we accepted. But there are certain exceptions that are required so that very sensitive sectors in Quebec and Canada, for the auto sector, for example, the component sector, these sectors are more vulnerable, and I think that we are a player in those areas, and we have to look at what we can do to support the auto industry and to preserve or ask for the end of these illegal tariffs that are still in effect. They are hurting Quebec more on lumber and aluminum and steel, of course. Now, the tariffs are well known, but the threat is still there. The president is unpredictable. Are you feeling somewhat exhausted after a couple of weeks of this campaign, knowing that this is not completely behind us? No, I'm not exhausted. My level of energy and enthusiasm is practically too high. However, there's something positive in what happened yesterday because that postpones the basic issues and conversations until after the election. For now, Mr. Trump's announcements were a pretext to interrupt the campaign, as if in the coming years in Quebec and Canada, that would be the only thing we had to deal with. Obviously, the U.S. threats are huge, but there are other issues we have to talk about. Environmental issues, for example, immigration issues that we have to talk about, culture, identity, and so on. So we have to have an election campaign where we can talk about all of that, because for now, we're only talking about trade, and even though trade is very important, we don't want that to be a pretext, an excuse to give a blank check to someone whose intentions remain unknown for the time being. TVA. I want to come back to supply management. You raised this. You're saying that this could be an issue in the negotiations. What can you do, and what concessions could be made or must be made with respect to supply management? None. Supply management is a system that protects Quebec companies and some others in Canada and consumers as well. Supply management allows us to introduce standards with respect to the use of hormones and antibiotics in products which do not exist in U.S. and which leads to better products and better quality products, more stable prices right across the country, in every region of Quebec and elsewhere. They all benefit from stable prices when it comes to eggs, milk, and other dairy products. So we're not going to sacrifice public health. We're not going to sacrifice our producers. So certainly there's a cultural exception, and that was introduced by Quebec in the period just before I became the president of ADISC. So I think there has to be an agricultural exception here because it is part of our identity, and it is absolutely essential if we want to feed people. Supply management should therefore be exempted from free trade. And if Western producers want to make a deal on beef, that's up to them. But we must protect environmental prerogatives because that's a national decision that we make. And in terms of social justice or their tax system, they're not going to say, well, you know, your tax measures are not consistent with free trade. Well, and of course, if we're talking about public services as well, we have to have the right to protect all of those things. And for supply managers, it's everything. Now, you talked about what should not be touched. What products should not be touched through the counter tariffs? Well, we are coming back to orange juice here. We know that we can buy the products that Quebec makes. Orange juice is not only a U.S. product, so we can have replacement products in some cases, not necessarily in every case. We can't get the equivalent of a counter tariff in each case. So we pay the price of a counter tariff, and that contributes to inflation and means that businesses are less able to adapt, such as the aeronautics industry, the agri-food industry, and I often give the example of my own riding, where I think there is the biggest ambulance builder, manufacturer in North America. And businesses like that are based on what they receive via truck from the U.S. and their ability to provide ambulances at a reasonable price will be over. So I think there are some things that have to be spared in the counter tariffs. Le Soleil, who should be part of the delegation for Quebec? No, I don't have any names to suggest at this time. Obviously, I'm thinking of certain individuals, but at the same time, I don't think Mr. Legault is going to call me to ask me who I want, and that's perfectly fine. On the principle, we agree. On the principle that he has the right to designate those people, he's the Premier of Quebec. His consultations will take place with the other parties represented in the National Assembly, but I certainly will not provide any names. You talked about the balance of power. You're talking about the balance of power in relation to Mr. Trump, not Mr. Carney. Well, not so long ago, I had three opponents, Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Carney, and Mr. Trump. And things can still move because there are 26 days until voting day, or 25 days. So in 25 days, things may be very different. Now, the balance of power, and once again, I think we have to be careful about this. I'm not going to be deciding this. I've heard a lot of comments in the media about that idea, and it hasn't been poorly received. But with the balance of power, we can make a contribution to a federal government that has to go and negotiate with the U.S., but we are also in a situation where we can...
You're watching live coverage here from Quebec City of Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, flanked by some of his candidates in the province. And what you were seeing at the same time on the right of your screen was NDP leader Jagmeet Singh as he was making an announcement in Ottawa. I'm going to bring you that in its entirety in just a moment. But I want to just talk and make sure that we understand fully what we're hearing from the Bloc leader. He's talking about, in light of the tariffs we've been covering so extensively today, when it gets time for Canada to review the terms of the Free Trade Agreement, CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Trade Agreement, he wants to ensure that there is not just national representation, Canadian representation, but there is specific Quebec representation at that negotiating table, because there are issues and concerns unique to Quebec as he laid them out. There are language and culture issues. There are issues notably of supply management, the quota system and supply for dairy and eggs. And you heard him say there that there will be no concessions from Quebec when it comes to the matter of supply management. So as to who that person would be, it would be up to the Premier, François Legault, to determine who would be at that table. But he wants, and if the Bloc wins the balance of power, he will ensure that that is the case when Canada begins to review the trade agreement with Mexico and the United States. And that is something he'd like to see sooner rather than later, with midterms coming in 2026. Kate McKenna, listening into all of that, I kind of gave an abbreviated version, Kate, but any additional details that really stood out for you that we should know about?
Well, he put a little bit of a positive spin on what happened yesterday, saying that this is sort of postponed this issue, the issue of tariffs, until the election is over. Now, it's not clear to me that that will be true, but certainly if the news had been different yesterday, we would be talking about potentially more tariffs on Canadians, which is a challenging position for the two parties that are not looking like they're going to form government. The NDP and the Bloc Québécois both kind of struggling to get a foothold in this conversation. But both yesterday and today, Yves-François Blanchet said, hey, if you elect the Bloc Québécois to be the balance of power in a government, in the future parliament, then you can make sure that Quebec interests will not be ignored, because we'll have a lot of power in the House of Commons. So repeating that message again today, I found that interesting as well.
So, Kate, stand by with me, because what we're going to do is take everyone to Ottawa next. And this is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. He's talking about the NDP plan to support the trade war effort. And there he is as he's getting underway in its entirety from beginning just moments ago. And again, you're watching CBC News Network.
Particularly in Windsor, the plant that we went to, auto workers woke up today with a 25% tariff on automotive imposed by Donald Trump. This is a direct attack on these workers. And for the workers that I met at Stellantis, they woke up to an announcement now that their plant has been shut down for 2 weeks. And what that means for these workers, who, like all workers now, are using their entire budget to pay their bills and to keep food on the table, they're wondering how they're going to actually make ends meet with 2 weeks less salary. I don't think anyone can do that in the current times we're in. No one can make it without half your pay, basically, without working 2 weeks this month. That means they're going to be wondering how they're going to make their mortgage payment, how they're going to pay their groceries, their bills. And so I'm thinking about those workers. I'm thinking about the steel and aluminum workers who are already living under those tariffs, and those workers who've already lost their jobs. And so our job number one has to be protecting these workers. And what I mean by that specifically is our employment insurance right now, the way it's set, effectively for a lot of these workers maybe only covers about a third of their income. How can most people make it with just a third of their income? You simply can't. So we need to have an EI that covers more of workers' salaries so they can actually pay their bills, pay their mortgage, keep food on the table. And that's got to be job number one today in the face of these tariffs, in the face of the impact on these workers. We need to protect these workers and make sure that they can actually keep their homes, keep food on the table, and keep paying their bills. And secondly, this reminds us that we've got to fight back and make sure that we are building a stronger economy in our country, and that means building Canadian and buying Canadian. We need a clear plan to build the infrastructure that we need in our country using Canadian products, Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian lumber. We need to use Canadian products and Canadian workers to build up a stronger economy, one that's more resilient. We also need to defend our interests. With these automotive sector tariffs that Donald Trump's imposed, we have to make sure that these companies do not take the manufacturing equipment the assets that we've invested in out of the country. We cannot let that happen. We have to put in whatever protections possible, laws to ban that from happening, protections in place so that we do not lose those assets, we do not lose that manufacturing capacity. And then in general, when it comes to this tariff, while we haven't seen the full brunt of it, we're experiencing the impacts of some of those tariffs right now. And we're living in constant fear of tariffs. And so Canadians have made a really tough decision. They said, you know, we're going to fight back. Canadians are making decisions to not buy, to boycott American products. They're picking up items at the shelves and saying, wait a second, is this Canadian or is this American? They are canceling their trips to the United States. And I want to commend Canadians for showing that resilience and that defiance and say, you know, I'm going to fight back. I'm going to defend my country. I'm going to fight back and protect our home. And so I want to give Canadians another chance to do that, another chance to contribute. When Canadians are looking for ways, what can I do? Well, here's something that you can do. We are announcing New Democrats will bring in a victory bond, like we did in the World War. This is an opportunity for Canadians to invest in our country. In fact, during the World War, victory bonds raised more revenue than taxes because Canadians were so committed to doing their part. So right now, for Canadians who are wondering, how can I contribute? A victory bond would be a guaranteed investment where you would purchase a bond, a 5-year or 10-year, and if you hold it to maturity, you would get all the revenue tax-free. So it's a way to, you know, we're going to need to raise money to be able to build the roads, the bridges, the infrastructure we need. Instead of relying solely on banks and paying debt and interest to those banks, let's pay interest to Canadians instead. And so I'm inviting Canadians to do their part, and this would be a way to do so. In contrast with the other parties, Mark Carney has said that, yes, we need to invest in building infrastructure in Canada, but he's also said the way to do that is to cut the services that Canadians need. I think Mark Carney is wrong. We cannot afford to cut the services Canadians need. At this time when we're up against so much uncertainty, Canadians need that support. We need our health care, we need our pensions, so the threat of cutting those things to pay for investments is wrong. And Pierre Poilievre's plan is deep cuts. His plan is deep cuts to the things that you need. That is the wrong thing to do. Deep cuts to health care, to child care, is only going to make life even more difficult and more uncertain in the face of these troubling times that we're in right now. So Pierre Poilievre's approach is also very wrong. We're saying we don't have to choose between investing in our country and in our infrastructure and keeping our services. We need to do both. We need a strong and vibrant healthcare. We need to fix it. We need to invest in it. We need good pensions. We need good services. And we need to build up an economy where we invest in our infrastructure. And this is one way to assist Canadians in doing that, by investing in Canada through victory bonds. Donc,
So I would like to begin by recognizing that today is a very tough day for auto industry workers. They woke up this morning seeing these 25% tariffs slapped on the industry, and the fear is real. I have met these workers and talked to them, workers from Stellantis who woke up this morning, and their plant has been shut down for 2 weeks. So how can someone make ends meet with 2 weeks less salary? It's impossible because of the cost of living. A lot of workers, or the majority of workers, use their entire wages in order to make ends meet. So it's very tough times for these workers. I'm thinking as well as workers in the aluminum and steel industries who have already lost their jobs because of tariffs. So our priority, our job number one, is to protect these workers, and that's why employment insurance has to be enhanced. And why am I saying that? Because employment insurance for many workers only covers a third of their wages. So we need to increase EI so that we can help workers, help them to make ends meet and have the ability to pay their bills, their mortgage, and buy groceries. And second, we must build a more resilient economy in Canada. So that means we have to build infrastructure in Canada. using Canadian products, Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian softwood lumber to build more infrastructure and create jobs. That's something we must do. And we have to defend our interests. That means equipment in plants where we must stop those companies from taking that equipment away, sending it across the border to the United States. We have to put a stop to that. And in relation to the threats from Donald Trump, even though there wasn't a major tariff applied to all sectors, we know that any day now Donald Trump could bring in more tariffs. At the same time, I'm proud to say that Canadians are very much wanting to defend this country and buy Canadian products. They canceled their vacations in the United States. They said, no, we're not going to go and spend money in the U.S. while we're in the middle of a trade war and we're receiving threats from another country. I'm really happy to see that kind of response and that resilience that Canadians are showing. And I want to give Canadians another opportunity to contribute. So today I'm announcing that a new Democrat government will reintroduce victory bonds, such as existed during the war. At the time, these victory bonds raised more income than taxes. So this is a very powerful way to use the power of Canadians who want to contribute. So these will be investments with guaranteed interest, and if you leave your investments in place until maturity, you will be able to receive that revenue tax-free. So that will be a way of contributing. And in these tough times, Canadians want to contribute. Rather than creating money for banks, we're doing something to help Canada. But what's the position of the other leaders? Mark Carney is proposing to cut services in order to pay for his investments in infrastructure, to cut the services that people need, and this is no time to do that. In my opinion, we must never cut services for people. And what is Pierre Poilievre's plan? His plan, or he's proposing in his plan, to make massive cuts to the services you require, such as health care. He's proposing to make cuts there, and that will be very costly, and it's not the right thing to do right now. It'll only make things worse. So our plan is to invest in infrastructure and keep our services in place. And that's what we can do through victory bonds.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, on va passer à la période de questions. Une question, une relance par journaliste. We'll now take the questions from the press. One question, one follow-up. We'll begin with Janice McGregor, CBC.
Good morning. When the Government of Canada stopped selling Canada Savings Bonds in 2017, it said it was doing so because the program was expensive to administer. There was better, more efficient ways for the government to raise revenue, but also that consumers had other investment options where they could have better returns than Canada Savings Bonds, and that's why the whole idea was sort of seen as a thing of the past. What makes you think that the bonds you're proposing now in this context are going to be any more successful than Canada Savings Bonds were, a decade or so ago?
Well, I think at first I want to acknowledge that that's true, that the savings bonds, of course, were discontinued, and the cost of administration at that point was higher than the uptake of the program. We're in a very different context right now. Canadians are making choices on their own, difficult choices. They're canceling vacations. It costs them to do that. It's difficult to do that. They're choosing to buy things that are Canadian instead of buying American products. On their own, Canadians saying, I want to do my part. So we're in a very different moment. We are in a type of war right now, in a trade war. And the threat of Donald Trump has made Canadians say, what can I do to stand up and defend my country? And for those Canadians who want to contribute, here's a way to do so. So we're in a very different context, and I'm very confident that if we use all the different means of providing people information about this, post offices, government announcements, using the avenues that we have, Canadians do want to do their part, and this is a way for Canadians to contribute. And we saw it when there's a need, like during the war. The Canadians invested massively in victory bonds. We're in a similar situation with a trade war, with the threats of Donald Trump. Canadians are really wrapping themselves in the flag and saying, I want to do my part, and here's the way Canadians can do their part. And it's in stark contrast to the proposals of the other parties. Pierre Poilievre is saying, cut the services Canadians need to give tax giveaways to the richest. Mark Carney is saying, investments in infrastructure, yes, but I'm going to pay for that by cutting the services that people need. I think both those approaches are wrong. This is a way to say, let's invest in Canada and give Canadians a chance to do so. Oui, donc dans le passé, oui, c'est vrai qu'on a eu des investissements dans le Canada qui n'ont pas fonctionné à l'époque.
Investments that were made that didn't work so well, but we're in a completely different situation now. Canadians and Quebecers themselves have decided to cancel their vacations in the U.S. They are ready to make sacrifices in order to protect our country. So in that context, where Canadians want to defend our country, I think that would be one way of doing it. It would be a way of contributing to our nation, to our country, by investing more in the infrastructure that we need.
I'd like to get some clarification about something you said near the end of an answer yesterday about the future of CUSMA. If I understood you correctly, you said that you aren't in favor of moving to a renegotiation or a review before it's due in 2026, that there were other ways to fight back against tariffs in the meantime. Of course, there's a lot of hot takes out there about this. We've had premiers calling for a negotiation faster, sooner, but maybe throwing Mexico under the bus, just pursuing a Canada-US deal alone. And a week ago, Mark Carney seemed to suggest that actually there might not be a fulsome renegotiation of CUSMA. I'd like some clarity on where the NDP stands about whether there should still be a North American trade agreement with Mexico. Is that what the NDP wants to continue?
Yeah, we want to be in solidarity with Mexico. In fact, right now, we are being targeted, like Mexico, unjustly, unfairly. There's a trade agreement that's been signed by this very president, who now is violating an agreement that he himself signed. And he's targeting, without provocation, Canada and Mexico. I think it's a moment of solidarity with Mexico. We are in a similar position where we've been attacked for no justification, for no reason. So we should show solidarity in fighting back together. And I stand by my comments. It sets a very bad precedent to renegotiate an agreement when the date that was set is in a year. There is no reason to renegotiate. Nothing has happened significantly that caused these tariffs in the first place, or this unjustified war in the first place. There's no justification to cancel the agreement before its end date.
Thank you.
Oui. Je pense qu'on doit rester en solidarité avec le Mexique.
I think we have
Donc,
to show solidarity with Mexico, so I do not agree with the idea of eliminating Mexico. I think we have to show solidarity because Donald Trump has attacked both of us without provocation in an unjustified manner. So I think we have to remain on the same side with Mexico. And I don't think we should be renegotiating an agreement when this same president signed that agreement and broke the agreement. So it sends a bad message to say, okay, we're going to renegotiate something when he in fact signed off on it. And in fact, the date for renegotiation is next year.
Good morning, Mr. Singh. If Canadians elect a minority Liberal government, what is one specific thing they would have to do to get your support?
Well, I can tell you that we have shown Canadians in minority governments that we fight for you, and we're going to continue to do that. We know that this election is very important, and I encourage you to vote for New Democrats. More New Democrats means more folks are going to fight for you. You elect enough of us, I would be honored to serve as Prime Minister, and I would fight every single day for you. Canadians will make that choice. And the choice that Canadians make, I want you to know that what choice you make, I will use the power that I have to fight for you. Some concrete examples, I believe that pharmacare is a good thing. It lowers the cost of medication for for provinces, it saves money for everybody. It takes the burden off of families who say, I can't afford to buy the medication I need to stay healthy. I would expand that very directly. I want to expand it so more provinces sign up to the program, and I want to cover more medications. And what Mark Carney has said is that he's not committed to that. So it shows you that if you want pharmacare, vote for New Democrats.
And given how the polls
All right, if you're just joining us, hello
right
everyone.
now,
I'm Natasha Fatah. Welcome inside the CBC newsroom. And we've been taking you to Ottawa, where NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has been making an election campaign announcement and answering questions from reporters. We'll continue to monitor his comments and bring you full analysis with CBC's Kate McKenna in just a moment. But first, we need to begin with the ongoing reaction from the global markets, from world leaders and consumers right around the world. There are new developments directly affecting Canada after Donald Trump's White House announcement yesterday. The U.S. president following through on a threat to take his trade war global. Now, Canada and Mexico were not hit with any new tariffs as Trump announced actions against more than 180 other countries. But there is another development that does directly impact Canada. Those damaging tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles are now in force. We are watching to see how the government here at home is going to react to those sweeping U.S. tariffs. Mark Carney is set to speak to the media at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And now let's turn our attention to Windsor, Ontario, which is often considered the engine of Canada's auto industry. The Stellantis plant will be going on temporary shutdown for 2 weeks. That's set to begin on Monday. In a statement out this morning, Stellantis confirms that Trump's tariffs are the key reason. The automaker says facilities in Mexico are also going to pause production. That will have a knock-on effect for Stellantis operations, of course, in the United States. And right now, all Canadian-made cars and light trucks crossing into the United States face a 25% tariff. However, that tariff rate is lower when there is more U.S.-made parts within those vehicles. Meeting the rules set out by the Free Trade Agreement remains the key issue for automakers, parts makers, and of course, their workers. We are going to bring you extensive coverage throughout the day with the latest reaction on Trump's trade war. We've got Katie Nicholson watching the story in Washington. As I mentioned, Kate McKenna is going to bring us the latest from Ottawa, and Scott Peterson is keeping an eye on the markets. But let's turn now to Kate, who's in our Ottawa bureau. She's been listening to Singh. She's watching all the developments there. What do you have, Kate?
Well, it's all tariffs all the time so far today. And the NDP put forward a new idea from them that they're calling victory bonds. So this is a World War II premise that they're bringing back because they say Canada is entering an economic war. So the idea is that Canadians would be able to buy bonds of different amounts, maybe $100, $500, and they could be for 5 or 10 years. And if they leave the money in the bonds, if they keep their bonds until they're fully matured, then they would get a slight return back. But the idea would be that that money would go to build infrastructure projects, things like bridges, ports, help support people's jobs, to make Canada's economy more resilient in the face of these tariff threats. Now, Jagmeet Singh, the leader, also spoke about the reports coming out of Windsor this morning that some people are going to be out of work in just a few days, and the what can happen to the auto sector, what's expected to happen in the auto sector as these tariffs take effect. He says that EI, employment insurance, needs to be reformed so that it covers more people, so that people are able to pay their bills essentially when they lose their work. And this has been very consistent with Jagmeet Singh's message throughout these months now, where we've been dealing with conflicting messages from the White House, where he says every decision that's made has to put workers first.
Kate, we're also getting reaction from the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as the Bloc Québécois leader. What are they saying?
Yeah, let's start with Yves-François Blanchette, the leader of the Bloc Québécois. He was out just a few minutes ago, and he is calling for Quebec to have a representative in negotiations, Canadian negotiations with the United States. And the reason for that, he says, is because there are some sectors that are extremely important to Canada, including language, including supply management, that cannot be lost or any concessions made in any sort of future negotiations with the United States. He also put a bit of a positive spin on the announcement that Canada is not on this long list of countries that's getting additional tariffs that Donald Trump put out yesterday. He says, well, now Canadians will be able to focus on the election and Canadian issues going into this election, and tariffs will take a bit of a backseat. Here's a look at what he said earlier.
So it could have been worse, but the best part of this all is that we still have 25 days during which we will be able to have a normal campaign or a more normal campaign, because the negotiations will start only after. We have to welcome Mr. Carney into the campaign. He's missing a good game.
This hour, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is also meeting with premiers. And then at 11:30, we're expecting to hear him potentially make some sort of announcement regarding retaliatory tariffs for the auto sector tariffs that took effect overnight. And we spoke with Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey a couple of hours ago, and he was asked what he'd like to see. He said he'd like to see a proportional response, a strong response, but not something that would aggravate Donald Trump further. Here's what he had to say.
From my perspective, yesterday changed nothing. In fact, it made it a little bit worse in that it could have incredible impacts in the auto sector in Ontario. And if people and if families, if the industry in Ontario is hurting, if families are hurting in Ontario, then we hurt here in Newfoundland and Labrador too.
It's worth noting that the Canadian government wasn't sure what to expect going into yesterday. We know that they have identified $95 billion of additional goods, that American goods that could be subject to counter tariffs. But Mark Carney has to walk a bit of a tightrope, because putting counter tariffs on too many things has the potential to hurt the Canadian economy as well. So we'll be watching at 11:30 to see what he decides to do.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kate McKenna in Ottawa. All right, folks, let's go to Washington now with CBC's Katie Nicholson. And I do also, before I throw to you, Katie, just mention some breaking news, because at the top of the show, I mentioned that Stellantis in Windsor, Ontario, is going to shut down its operations for 2 weeks, directly because of these tariffs coming in from the U.S. president. Well, we've now got an update from Stellantis operations in the United States. They've just put out a wire saying 900 U.S. employees are in Michigan and Indiana are going to be temporarily laid off due to idling plants in Canada and Mexico. So already, less than 24 hours after that announcement, we are getting hit with 900 people being laid off just in the United States, and who knows where it goes from here. So with all of that in mind, Katie, let's walk through again for people at home what came out of the announcement from Donald Trump yesterday. Let's talk about his global expansion of this trade war.
Yeah, I mean, Stellantis is a great example. There is no doubt that President Trump and those charts really upended the global economy. So today, his team is out there trying to defend the plan as markets plunge, and I guess they're going to have to counter things like those Stellantis layoffs. So Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, called this a golden age for America. She's out there saying that the more than 180 countries that are named in these tariffs, they have been ripping off America for 70 years. Here's a little bit of her trying to put a spin on how this is going to not necessarily, I guess, impact everyday consumers, trying to really push forward to the long-term goals and economic agenda of this government.
To anyone on Wall Street this morning, I would say trust in President Trump. This is a president who is doubling down on his proven economic formula from his first term. And the United States of America is no longer going to be cheated by foreign nations around the world. And as the president declared yesterday, this is indeed a national emergency.
So Leavitt there sort of talking about the markets, which are down globally, and really sort of throughout that interview kind of skirted directly answering questions about how this is going to immediately impact the cost of living for a lot of Americans, and sort of, again, pushing to those broader economic platforms. And that's exactly the same strategy that we saw Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick use on CNBC this morning, also stressing the gains for the U.S. They're going to be in the long term, in the medium term, not really talking about what the short-term pain is going to mean. And here's Vice President J.D. Vance selling the agenda on Fox this morning.
We've seen closing factories. We've seen rising inflation. We've seen the cost of housing so high that most Americans can't afford to buy a home right now. President Trump is taking this economy in a different direction. He ran on that, he promised it, and now he's delivering. And yes, this is a big change. I'm not going to shy away from it, but we needed a big change, Lawrence. We cannot keep going down the Joe Biden globalist pathway where we have $2 trillion of peacetime debt and deficits. We have manufacturing disappearing. That is not working for Americans.
And then there is the tariff man-in-chief, the president this morning posting on Truth Social that the operation is over. The patient lived and is healing. The prognosis is that the patient will be far stronger, bigger, better, and more resilient than ever before. Make America great again. So let's just go back to the Rose Garden announcement yesterday. So this was an across-the-board 10% tariff on imported goods, and some countries were hit much harder, including allies in Europe and Asia, harsher than some analysts had expected. And there are also criticisms as to how haphazard some of these tariffs appear to be, and some really bizarre targets, right? So you take the herd in McDonald Islands near Antarctica. To be clear, the only inhabitants there are penguins, and they were hit by a 10% tariff, which would be funny if all of this weren't so serious and the chaos around these tariffs weren't so serious. There is really confusion around the end game here. So how does this fit in with the administration's end goals? Is this a permanent economic policy, or is this some sort of an opening to negotiations? And that was a message that was sort of tracked last night by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, urging other countries to take a breath, not immediately retaliate. But of course, businesses here are just bracing for higher costs almost immediately. Just consider a restaurant here in the U.S. So you're buying coconut oil from Thailand. Well, that's now hit with a 36% tariff, 36%. So what would that do to the business's bottom line? How is that cost going to be borne? Does it go to the consumer? How is that going to go over then with Americans who are already pretty ticked off about affordability and the cost of living? These are sort of the ramifications and the fallout that the Trump administration is really going to have to get ahead of and try to push back against.
There's so much that remains unclear still at this moment, Katie. And one of the things is that there's this sense that Canada wasn't on the list, so it's okay. But that's not, in fact, the case, because the president in that executive order did make it quite clear that there would be a 25% tariff on almost all goods and 10% on energy and potash if Canada does not meet the requirements of the CUSMA or USMCA agreement. So just walk us through on that, because there's also been some pushback from the U.S. Senate. What are you seeing?
Right. So that initial wave of tariffs that came in under that national emergency sort of order, that act that the president tried to use, using fentanyl coming across the northern border as a sort of a justification, that sort of was being pushed back on. There was a resolution from Tim Kaine, a senator from Virginia, who's a Democrat, that was co-signed by Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, who is a Republican, basically questioning whether or not the president should have used that order, seeking to limit the use of that power and really sort of roll back that first wave of tariffs. And surprisingly, that managed to pass in the Senate last night. So 4 Republican senators with states with those close geographic or economic ties to Canada broke ranks. And this is even after they were name-checked by President Trump in a social media post. So we're talking about Susan Collins from Maine, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and of course Rand Paul from Kentucky. And Paul was really a bit of a firebrand on the floor last night. I mean, he usually is, but he really let fly with his distaste on tariffs ahead of that vote. Here's a little bit of that tape.
Tariffs are a terrible mistake. They don't work. They will lead to higher prices. They are a tax, and they have historically been bad for our economy. But even if this were something that was magic and it was going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I wouldn't want to live under emergency rule.
Now, of course, this still isn't really expected to go anywhere. The House Republicans are hoping to be able to fend off this specific resolution. But there is another one that's sort of bubbling up. This one is coming from House Democrats. There's a strategy from a New York representative named Greg Meeks. He wants to introduce a privileged resolution, which is basically going to force a House vote over tariffs. It's kind of a procedural move, and you can use it to try to bypass leadership in the House and force votes. So that is something to watch for. Again, that isn't necessarily going to go anywhere. The president made clear yesterday he was going to veto anything like this that came across his desk. But what it does do is it does force House Republicans to stand up and say where it is that they stand on tariffs in this moment that is maybe increasingly fraught.
Katie Nicholson in Washington. Thank you, Katie. And Trump's move has put global markets on a free fall. Let's turn to CBC's business host, Scott Peterson, who's joining me in studio. So, Scott, everybody's watching this. How bad is it at this point?
It's terrible. Markets are just saying this is the worst thing that they've seen since protection-wise from the U.S. economy since the 1930s. And global markets are really reacting to this global trade war that is now upon everyone. And to show you how serious it is, and the markets are a litmus test for truth, after all, $2 trillion in market value has been wiped away from these markets today all by themselves. Let's take a look at some of what's going on out there as far as these are businesses, these are individuals betting with their money. We're seeing the Dow Jones now at session lows, 1,500 points off it. It's about 3.5% to the downside. We're seeing the same thing with the S&P 500, the high-flying NASDAQ exchange, and the TSX as well is down severely. We've got the price of oil down $5 a barrel. We have the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, unusually up against the strength of the U.S. dollar. And when we dig into this, we're looking at a whole range of manufacturers that are getting anybody that does deals with overseas markets. For example, Vietnam, Indonesia, and China with the tariffs imposed there. We've got Lululemon down about 11%. Nike's down over 10%. We've got Under Armour down 8%. Apple does a lot of their manufacturing in China. Those shares down 8%. That represents $255 billion of investment market cap just been wiped out. And it's not just manufacturers, it's also the big heavyweights, the financials in the U.S. like J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and on and on. Walmart's down about 2%. We've got Dollar Tree down 11%, and it goes on from there. Citigroup says that this a 54% tariff applied to China will be the biggest penalty that China has experienced since the First World War. We're also seeing everyday consumers expecting to pay on average about 23% more based on a $2 trillion or $3 trillion worth of imports that the U.S. has every day. But the big part here, Natasha, is the uncertainty. Derek Burleson, the economist from TD Bank, sort of outlines, particularly in Canada, how this uncertainty is really going to affect business investment here.
It's uncertainty right now. I think investors in Canada, companies, are worried. And so while we escape the new additional tariffs, it's still going to be a challenging period for Canada as companies kind of navigate through very uncertain global waters as they look to where they're going to invest their next dollar.
That's part of the problem here is if any business investment out there, they're thinking, do we set up shop in Canada? Do we set it up in the U.S.? And probably they'll be setting it up in U.S., and that's going to hurt Canada down the road.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thanks, Tasha.
So this trade war is not only having an economic impact, but of course, as you know, it's had a huge damaging impact on the relationship between Canada and the United States. For more on this, we have reached former Canadian ambassador to the United States, Frank McKenna. He also served as the Premier of New Brunswick. Ambassador McKenna, thank you very much, sir, for making time for us today.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I wonder, after yesterday's announcement at the Rose Garden from Donald Trump, what are you discerning about the Canada-U.S. relationship at this point?
Well, it continues to deteriorate, obviously. The United States has gone rogue. It basically has taken itself out of the League of Nations, if you want, and wants to go alone with a nativist protectionist policy, bigger than neighbor kind of policy. And the United States is big and powerful enough that it may be able to do that. But there's going to be an awful lot of wreckage, both in the United States and in other countries around the world. And leave the material impact of that aside, a lot of that wreckage is going to be around trust in the relationship. We've had decades of working under free trade agreements that we all signed on. And now those have been torn up, and decisions that were made by auto companies and other companies based on the word of the law and based on legally binding agreements, those have all gone out the window. So it's going to be very hard to put this genie back in the bottle once you let it out. And Pax Americana, unfortunately, may very well be a thing of the past. And people in the world, including Canada, are going to be finding other friend groups and developing other relationships.
You mentioned that the United States might be big and powerful enough to just go at it on their own. But let's talk about, again, the Canadian situation, because while we may have been spared in an odd way yesterday, we've still been hit with a significant number of tariffs, including the brand new ones that came into effect midnight last night on the auto industry. Steel and aluminum industries are dealing with this. There's always the threat of more tariffs to come. What can Canada do at this point to support our industries? Because we don't have the economic might that the U.S. does.
Well, look, to start with, you mentioned the United States being big and powerful, and they are. But I would note that the only country in the world that's ever invoked Section 5 of NATO, asking for the defense of other members of NATO, is the United States of America. In terms of the specifics, you're absolutely right. Yesterday, we got spared so-called reciprocal tariffs. We shouldn't have been subject to them anyway. But we're experiencing the full fury of the 25% tariffs and the 10% tariffs that went in March 4th, and also the tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are almost exclusively directed towards Canada, because we're by far and away the biggest provider in the case of aluminum, some 70%. So I think what we're going to be doing is reacting to that. And by the way, what particularly angers me is the auto treatment. It's just a carefully constructed relationship that spans decades. And in the case of our auto workers, in Windsor, for example, Stellantis, I just feel the pain of people in that community. And what really angers me is that Trump has the support of U.S. auto workers who are basically attacking their Canadian brothers and sisters. Simultaneously, we have something like 1,500 nurses and doctors crossing the border every day from Windsor to Detroit to keep their healthcare system afloat. And during the COVID epidemic, when we had more deaths in Michigan than all of Canada put together, the Canadian brothers and sisters crossing that border looking after auto workers did that without ever taking any concern for their own health. So in terms of the merits of what's taking place, it's repugnant to everything that we believe in Canada about friendship and respect and civility. And unfortunately, it's going to fracture the relationship for a long time to come.
So how do our federal leaders and, frankly, our provincial leaders manage the situation? We also find ourselves in the midst of a federal election where we've got Mark Carney serving for the first time as the leader of the Liberal Party, running for the first time to be a member of Parliament, and also simultaneously becoming the Prime Minister just a few weeks ago and having to play multiple roles. What does he need to do in these next few days and weeks?
Well, look, you've noted that we are in the middle of all of these stressful events. But, you know, adversity breeds character. And I think the Canadian character is on prominent display. 40 million people wearing Team Canada jerseys, fighting for Canada, which is a powerful force. And all the political parties aligned. There is not a bit of sunlight between them in terms of their approach on this matter. You've got former Prime Minister Harper talking about the fact we need to take whatever pain is necessary. You've got leaders of all the parties standing up. In the case of Prime Minister Carney, he's doing what he needs to do. He's doing his job, quite frankly, with the support of Dominic LeBlanc and Melanie Joly, who are in the press every day and who are carrying the message to Americans. He's doing his job and looking prime ministerial and doing it, but I think he's doing the job because that is what he signed up for. And quite frankly, I think everybody in the country right now is rallying behind our leaders of all political stripes as we fight this battle.
Ambassador Frank McKenna, a real pleasure to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Mark Carney will give an update on Canada's response to new U.S. tariffs next hour. But Canada's steel and aluminum industries are already facing President Donald Trump's wrath, having been hit with a 25% tariff back on March the 12th. Canada supplies the U.S. with almost 60% of its aluminum imports. So for more on all of this, let's bring in Francois Racine. He is the CEO of ALU Quebec, an aluminum industry advocacy group. Francois, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, sir, I'm glad to hear it's a pleasure because for so many, it has been such a difficult few days and past difficult 24 hours. Now that we're in the next day, how are you feeling the day after Trump's announcement yesterday in the Rose Garden?
I don't know. It's not really good news for Canadian manufacturers. I mean, it's basically the continuation of what was in place. That's our understanding, meaning that the 25% on aluminum and aluminum products exported to the U.S. is still on. And on top of that, there's still a 25% tariff on non-UMCA compliant exports to the U.S. So one adds with the other. I mean, in some cases, we're talking 50%. On top of an increase of raw materials for manufacturers with the price increase of the value of aluminum, plus on top of that, counter tariffs from Canada on some aluminum imports that are needed by our manufacturers for products they are selling here or re-exporting to the U.S.
Francois, this question is difficult because I'm asking you to go into the mind of the U.S. president and this administration, but why aluminum? Why is steel and aluminum being targeted so intensely with you guys being slapped with the tariffs early on and when the U.S. is so dependent on Canada for this resource?
That's why it's difficult to understand. I think the president thinks that they can bring back the capacity, production capacity of aluminum they had in the past and be self-sufficient. The reality is that they are in deficit of about 4 million tons a year of primary aluminum, most of which comes from Canada. And rebuilding that capacity with the power needed to bring that capacity back, we're talking probably $75 to $100 billion worth of investments that would be done over a few decades. I mean, it's something pretty massive. And they're talking about a few potential projects, but I mean, we're not there yet. And those potential projects would fill some of the gap of imports that are coming from overseas. But again, the reality is, I mean, they will be dependent on imports, ideally from Canada or others for many years to come.
Can I ask you, what's been the impact of the tariffs so far on the industry?
If we talk about the primary aluminum producers, not significant impact. I mean, the customers are still buying it because it's UMCA exempt. So there's only the 25% tariff in place, which applies to all the imports from all over the world. So Canada is at the same place as it was versus the others. It is just making aluminum more expensive for U.S. companies and companies in North America. Where it's hurting our Canadian manufacturers is with the same tariffs also applies for products containing aluminum or made with aluminum. In fact, the percentage value of the aluminum over the products that are exported is subject to a 25% tariff. So if we're talking about window frames, light poles, packaging, whatever you want, which contains aluminum, it is subject to also a 25% tariff, which was not the case in 2018 when there was a tariff on aluminum. It was just primary aluminum. The difference now is that it also applies to basically everything containing aluminum. And this is hurting the manufacturers here in Canada.
And so there's a compounding effect, and it's still early on. So let's say the tariffs stay in place for months. Let's say months for now, it could turn into years, but let's say they stay in place and not getting lifted anytime soon. What do you foresee happening to the Canadian aluminum industry?
Again, if we talk about, because there's two realities, the ones for primary aluminum producers, I mean, they will continue to produce and sell aluminum. Again, at this point, Canada is at par with the others, so no changes really. It will be just more expensive. If we talk about manufacturers who are making car components or making the other products that I mentioned before, many of them have already lost their U.S. Customers, have been turned down by their customers because they don't want to pay a potential tariff or an existing tariff in that case. So what's at stake is really our imports of products to the U.S. that contain aluminum, especially if aluminum plays a significant role in the products. It's a significant cost component. It's really predictable that many Canadian manufacturers will lose their U.S. customers and will have to look at other markets, which is not easy to do, but most likely they will simply see their the volume of business go down.
Francois, we're in the middle of a federal election. Whoever the next prime minister is, what do you need from them? What does this industry need in terms of support?
Well, obviously, I would like to see the tariff go away, but it's not completely in their hands. Obviously, it's the president of the U.S. that will make the final decision. But whatever can be done to hopefully make those tariffs go away will be helpful. On top of that, and we've been vocal about this, we support counter tariffs, especially on finished goods, finished products that we can decide to buy or not to buy. But we are definitely against counter tariffs that applies to raw material, for example, aluminum that we need from the U.S. And at this point, there's a 25% counter tariff. So on top of what we discussed before, the price of aluminum used by Canadian manufacturers in some cases is 25% more expensive if it comes from the U.S. And in many cases, it comes from there because we're not making those aluminum components here in Canada. And the only or most likely alternative is China, with whom we already have also a 25% tariff since October 15. So we want them to remove the tariffs that applies that are used as raw materials for our manufacturers.
Francois Racine, I wish you so much luck, and thank you so much for making time for us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, the impact of the auto tariffs will be felt in both Canada and the United States. We're feeling it already now. The center of the U.S. auto industry is in the border city of Detroit, Michigan, just across the river from Windsor, Ontario. And that's where we find CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick today. So, Megan, what are you hearing about the auto tariffs and how they could impact Americans?
Hi, Natasha. Yeah, we're right downtown Detroit, known as the Motor City. And this city, like Windsor, just on the other side of the river, is bracing for the impact of these tariffs now as they start to play out. And the big companies here, the big three auto companies, trying to assess what this really means for their companies and what it's going to mean for workers here in this state in particular. An estimated 1 in 5 jobs in Michigan is tied to the auto industry. And we're going to talk to someone now who knows all about this. This is Glenn Stevens Jr. And why don't you tell us what your title is and where we are right now?
Right. I'm the executive director of Mich Auto. We are the statewide industry association, so the voice for the industry. We work very closely with the Canadian government and all the suppliers across the border, and we're looking at what this tariff stack up means for our industry right now.
Yeah, just in general, my first question is, how are you feeling today, and what's the mood like here in Detroit in the industry, given that these tariffs are now going ahead?
Well, I think the mood is the same as it's been for a couple of months now. A lot of uncertainty and to a certain amount a degree of instability and really paralysis. What do we do? How do we make decisions? It's a long lead time business. It requires certainty, and we don't have that right now. We're concerned about input costs, and we're concerned about the price of the vehicle going up.
Yeah, tell me more about that. What do you think some of the consequences could be of these tariffs? What is it going to mean for everyday Americans?
Well, from everybody from a small supplier all the way up to a large supplier, and they're on both sides of our border. And we look at our border as seamless. We really don't see one when we look at the automotive industry. So we know that those companies are going to struggle, but we also know that the stack up will mean anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000, maybe as much as $10,000 to a sticker price of a vehicle. That's too much for the consumer. It's already at a high. We're worried about production, and we're worried about the backward push on demand and then on jobs.
Well, exactly. Let's talk more about that, because we're hearing news this morning from Stellantis about possibly 900 people being laid off. We're trying to get more details and confirmation on that, Glenn. But what are you hearing on that front so far this morning?
We're hearing a lot of different things, but we're hearing what people are doing is pausing to assess. They're looking at their supply chains. They're looking at their production. They're looking at where they can do things, they can't do things, because you have to mitigate this. You cannot absorb this amount of tariffs as a small company or a large company, and you can't pass it to the consumer. So there's a lot of assessment going on right now, and we are concerned about cutbacks.
And we don't know yet exactly how many jobs could be lost. There aren't really any solid numbers on that yet. But I am curious, Glenn, we know what Donald Trump's end goal is here. He wants manufacturing brought back to the U.S., doesn't want it to be happening in Canada and Mexico anymore. How are the big companies reacting to that goal? Are they going to meet it? Are they going to do what Donald Trump wants them to do and actually shut down their plants in Canada?
They're not going to do it overnight. It takes a lot of time to build brick and mortar, to move lines, even to move parts from machine to machine. There are processes. So what we're looking for, what the big companies, the small companies, we'd like to see a reopening of the USMCA. Let's use something that's been working. Let's improve that. Let's keep this trade bloc together so it can compete globally.
And I know you put that in a letter to the White House. Your group has been lobbying the White House. What else did you say in that letter to the White House?
Well, we're very specific, and we really are for more manufacturing in Michigan and the U.S., but not at the expense of Canadian jobs. That's not what we're looking to do. That's not what we want. What we want to see is border security, which we're all working on collectively, both for illegal drugs and immigration, and we want to see more manufacturing. But we'd like to see it in a methodical, planned out trade bloc that works mode of operation, and that's what we're asking the White House for.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. Glad I know you have a very busy day and probably a lot of calls and a lot of meetings, so we'll let you get back to work. Thanks for your time this morning. Okay, Natasha, so there you go. A little bit of what we're hearing so far in Detroit, and we're going to spend a bit more time here this morning tracking reaction on how these tariffs are being absorbed and what people think here on this side of the river. I can see Windsor right over there, right across the river, but here on the Detroit side, again, that's the perspective we're hearing so far from the auto industry, which is, again, extremely important to the state of Michigan.
Okay, CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Detroit, Michigan. Thanks so much. All right, folks, let's take you now to Queen's Park in Toronto, where Ontario Premier Doug Ford is speaking.
Call into Mark Stewart, the Unifor representative, just a minute ago. I called him again last night, just to reassure him that we're going to be there and support him. I believe, and this is really because of our relationship that we built, that we were going down there, we were communicating constantly, and there was a big relief we didn't see our name on the list, but that doesn't mean these tariffs are disappearing. So I'm a strong supporter of showing the U.S. that we negotiate through strength, not weakness, and it'll be up to the Prime Minister to tell the country how we're going to retaliate.
Premier, what is your government going to do for the auto workers who are already being laid off? And we don't know for how long. Stellantis issued a notice last night. We are hearing that in the United States, Stellantis factories are also going to be shutting down.
Well, we're working with the federal government. They'll be making announcements, and we'll be there to support the auto workers every which way we can.
Through retraining, through some...
Well, I hope it doesn't come to retraining, because hopefully this plant's going to reopen. It's a temporary shutdown. I've mentioned my concerns to the CEO of Stellantis and how we need to have this plant up and going, which it should be up and going.
Do we have a better understanding right now exactly what is being applied to the auto sector and what could be exempt?
Well, what I understand, Colin, and as you saw yesterday, it's about as clear as mud, but this is what I'm understanding, that eventually it's going to be half of let's say a vehicle's 50% American parts, then half of those Canadian parts are going to be tariffed, which equals 12.5%. But 12.5% still is unacceptable. We have to get down to 0%.
Premier, the Stellantis is laying off 900 people in Michigan and Indiana already because of the Windsor shutdown and
yes.
the Mexican plant shutdowns. Is that faster than you expected? And what kind of message do you think that is going to send to the Trump administration?
Well, thank you for that question. I've been saying all along, I thought it would last about a week, but obviously it's right down to days now on the supply chain. And I've been saying this over and over again, a tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans. I mentioned Termination Day. There's a perfect example. That's just one company, one sector, not to mention all the other sectors. If they continue wanting to go after our lumber is used for housing in the U.S. It's a high-grade lumber, and that's just going to drive the cost up of housing. If they go after, continue to go after the auto sector, it's going to drive the cost up of autos for Americans. And if they go after our pharmaceuticals, especially seniors that rely on more cost-effective pharmaceuticals, that's going to drive the cost up. I'm very happy to see some of the senators, Republican senators, supporting us. Rand Paul, very vocal. He said a tariff on Canada would drive the U.S. into a recession. I agree with those comments. I'm glad that we're bringing the temperature down. It was absolutely essential that everyone just cools out a little bit and thinks straight. Because as the president mentioned yesterday, you saw the list of all the countries. He has bigger issues than targeting his closest friends and allies, but we're going to continue communicating with our counterparts in the U.S., Congress, the Senate, and as well as the governors. And yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
What's on the table right now for Ontario potential retaliations?
Well, something, I'm going to let the Prime Minister respond to that at 11:30. On Ontario's side, we're still going to keep the alcohol off the shelves, and that's one of the impacts. But as you can say, Samaritan.
Are you calling for a stronger response than what we're going to see from Mr. Carney at 11:30? You said you supported a strong response, but you're not telling us what he's going to do.
Yeah, just to be fair to the Prime Minister, I think it's a fair response. I appreciate all the support across the country, and it's every premier. There's no exclusions. I'm glad to see the support of premiers out in the West as well, because I think it's a measured response, and that's what we need to do.
Premier, are you going to be continuing your own discussions with Howard Lutnick and his team, or are you sort of taking a step back and deferring to the Prime Minister on this?
Well, we're all working together. We're working with, Secretary Lutnick. We had great conversations with him. I spoke to the Prime Minister late last night, along with Dominic LeBlanc as well. It's really a Team Canada effort right now. We're all working together. The Prime Minister actually encouraged all the premiers to continue their consultation, collaboration with their counterparts in the U.S. And I think that's so critical that we continue to do that.
And Premier, it seems like you've been, you've been working closely with Mark Carney, and you mentioned that your MPPs would be too swamped to do anything in this election campaign.
Yes.
At least yesterday, that did not seem to be the case with Caroline Mulroney. I'm just wondering if she sought your permission to endorse Pierre Poilievre, if you gave it, and also what you make of your campaign manager's recent comments towards the CBC.
Yeah, so twofold. I said it's really up to the MPPs what they want to do. Caroline called me. I think the world of Caroline, by the way. She does an incredible job as president of the Treasury, and asked me, and that's up to Caroline, and good for her and everyone else. But we need to focus on our job. Our number one job is to make sure we continue to protect the people of Ontario, focus on the tariffs. I do want to make a comment about the outages right across the north. It's heartbreaking. You get these messages, and I'm getting like every 15 seconds messages. We have now 3,700 boots on the ground from all over. I want to thank, which I did, thank Francois Legault, Premier of Quebec, for sending Quebec Hydro, as well as Scott Moe over in Saskatchewan, and everyone from Windsor Hydro to all the way up, all the GTA and in Toronto. We've reconnected over 800,000 homes, and we still have right around about 190,000 more to go. We're working full out. Again, we have the teams out there from emergency management, the Ontario Corps, warming centers, foods brought in. I got to give a shout out to a couple, Rubicon and Global Medics. They're out there supporting, be it food or cutting down trees. And I just want to thank the people. I mentioned yesterday, when someone's internet is down and televisions are down, we have to come up with a new mechanism to communicate, because it's very difficult to communicate when people don't have the ability to watch the television. So I think we have to come up with something with the cell phones, because that's their number one concern out there is communication. I know the CEO is going to be up there today in Oro Medonte. I'll be heading up tomorrow to see how I can support anyone up there.
This is the last question.
Yeah, go.
On the auto tariffs, the American president has made it very clear that he wants to relocate manufacturing to the United
That's right.
States. I know it's 12%, not 25%, but where do you see the threat level right now when it comes to those tariffs in the auto manufacturing sector? Is the threat still fairly high in your view?
I think the threat's very high. Even at 12.5%, these auto companies aren't making money hand over fist. They're basically trying to get by day by day and keep their people employed. So our goal is to continue negotiating down to a 0%. I truly believe the president's waiting for this election to be over on April 28th. I can't wait for it to be over. Tell the president I'll call him back in a minute. But anyways, we're going to continue. We're going to continue working hand in hand with the administration, with the federal government as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Thank you.
That is the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, speaking to reporters at Queen's Park, the provincial legislative building, referencing what is leading our news coverage today, the tariffs that have been announced by the American president yesterday, reciprocal tariffs across more than 180 countries, but somehow Canada and Mexico dodged yesterday's announcement because of the CUSMA agreement. Let's turn to CBC's Kate McKenna, who's joining us from Ottawa. And she's been listening. She's listening to all the federal leaders. Now she's listening to all the premiers. She's got us covered. So, Kate, what stood out for you from what we heard from Doug Ford?
Well, he reacted to reports that the Stellantis plant in Windsor is going to stop working for a couple of weeks. So he said, you know, the threat in his view is still very high, even though Canada is looking at less than 25% tariffs on vehicle exports. It's still too much money. They want to work all the way down to 0% tariffs. He says that he hopes it doesn't come to retraining these workers, hopes that the plant reopens as soon as possible to get people working as soon as they can. He also, he would have been in a meeting with the Prime Minister and the other premiers that was set to start at 10 o'clock. So it seems as though the meeting is done now, given that he was out speaking to reporters. But he wouldn't bite on questions about what retaliation is in the window yet. He said he's going to leave that to Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's set to come out and speak at 11:30. But he said he wanted a strong response. He said he's happy with where the Prime Minister landed on that. But he did say that we're going to have to wait and see for what comes next.
Okay, thanks so much, Kate.
You're welcome.
Now, friends, let's take you to Montreal, where Green Party co-leader Jonathan Pedneau has been speaking.
My friends, as Donald Trump is pulling America inwards, Canada has to look outward with courage, with vision, and with purpose. His latest wave of tariffs isn't just bad policy, it's also a signal. It's a warning, but it's also first and foremost an opportunity for Canada. For far too long, Canada has played the role of a resource supplier. We digged, we shipped, and we waited. We extracted as they manufactured, and we subsidized while they profited. That model is broken. What happened yesterday is marking a turning point, and it should be seen as an opportunity by Canadians. When the United States is slamming the door on fair trade, the way it did yesterday, Canada can and must step forward as a builder, as a partner, and as a democratic powerhouse for the rest of the world. What happened yesterday, of course, creates tremendous opportunities for Canada. But one thing is clear, Canada's manufacturing base didn't erode by accident. It was systematically gutted. It was hollowed out by decades of trade deals and corporate lobbying that prioritized U.S. profits over Canadian jobs. We saw the plants close, we saw the machinery shipped to the south, and we saw towns hollowed out while good-paying jobs, unionized jobs, were shipped south at the detriment of Canadian workers. Now the same U.S. government that let this happen, regardless of whichever party, Democratic or Republican, is turning its back on global trade entirely. Well, that means that it's time for us to stop waiting for them to come around, and it's time for us to build our own path forward. Here in Canada, for Canadians, with our resources, we can offer something bold, a 21st century manufacturing strategy that is anchored in democratic, green, and sovereign values. And this is something that can benefit both Canada, but also the rest of the world. We can build EVs, electric vehicles, here in Canada that will be stamped made in Canada. We can turn our raw lithium and our cobalt into the batteries that are needed for the 21st century's economy. We can also prove that Canada can be the reliable, stable, and democratic partner that is needed in everything from clean energy to artificial intelligence. It is crucial that we seize this opportunity because this is a once-in-a-generation chance for Canada. When the U.S. alienates its allies the way it did, the world is looking for stability, for democracy, and also for competence. When the U.S. abandons democratic norms, the world will turn, and it is turning already, to countries that still believe in those democratic norms, and that's Canada. We've got all the talent and none of the chaos. And that is something that we must leverage as an independent nation to build our manufacturing base here at home. The Green Party of Canada believes that this is our moment, not to react, but to lead to build the strong democratic manufacturing capacity that the rest of the world will be looking after as Donald Trump continues to trample democracy at home, but also push his allies and allies of the United States away from the U.S.
That is Jonathan Pedno, the co-leader of the Green Party in this federal election campaign. Let's turn to CBC's Kate McKenna once again in Ottawa to give us a summary of what we've just heard from the Greens. Kate?
Well, he had a bit of a message of hope, an uplifting message saying that this is a turning point in Canada-U.S. relations, but it could be an opportunity for Canada to really assert itself on the world stage and build a manufacturing sector that is green and profitable. He noted in particular that Canada could build EVs here, could turn lithium and cobalt into batteries. We know that Canada has about 4% of the world's reserve of lithium. And he also said that Canada can be a reliable and stable democratic partner, and that the U.S. has not been in recent months. So he's kind of calling on on Canadians to elect the Green Party and try to turn those words into action.
CBC's Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Thanks so much, Kate.
You're welcome.
Now stay tuned. We are going to bring you live special coverage from Ottawa coming up at the top of the hour with Rosemary Barton and David Cochran, who are going to lead our coverage in terms of the federal reaction to Donald Trump's tariff announcement yesterday. We are expecting to hear from Mark Carney any moment now. They'll bring that to you live.
CBC News.
This is a CBC News special presentation.
Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton, CBC's chief political correspondent here in the nation's capital, where we are waiting to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney less than 24 hours after Donald Trump upended the way trade around the world works and decided to not go ahead with some tariffs for this country, but proceed with others. What we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister today is what Canada's response will be. He indicated to the President on the phone last Friday that there would be a response in terms of counter tariffs, but given that there was no global universal tariff put on all Canadian exports to the United States, we will have to see how far the government intends to go. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, says that he spoke to the Prime Minister yesterday. He, of course, is also going to get on a call with the Premiers and the Prime Minister shortly, or that's already happened, sorry. And he says that it is a measured response that we can expect from Canada today. I'm going to bring in the host of Power and Politics, David Cochrane, who's, of course, joining our coverage today. So because it wasn't as widespread as possible, I would imagine that the counter tariffs have to be fairly targeted and probably not go up as high as they could go.
Yeah, there's 100% going to be counter tariffs. There's no question about that. It's a question of how big the response is, because the impact on this is quite profound, particularly on the auto sector, where those tariffs came into effect at 12:01 a.m. Last night. Already, we have seen closures out of in Windsor, Ontario, the Stellantis plant. Affects about 3,200 jobs, is what Stellantis is saying, 900 jobs in the United States. But I was speaking with Lana Payne earlier this morning, the president of Unifor. She talks about the feeder systems and that whole ecosystem that feeds into these plants, and she thinks it could be 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 jobs that are affected by this, at least in a temporary layoff. But there's a larger knock-on effect. The 25% tariff is in place on Canadian vehicles that get sold into the United States. You back it down from 25% based on what share of the parts used in that are actually made inside the United States, which gets it down to maybe 12.5%, depending on where it is. You know, you're still talking about a $5,000 tariff on a single vehicle, right? So this is an astronomical thing that eats into margins. Flavia Volpe talks about this sector operating on 6-7% profit margins, so a 12% tariff puts you underwater. So you're seeing parts plants being delayed because they don't want to make those parts, put them into vehicles without knowing exactly the full consequence of it down the line, because there's a second review on how tariffs get applied to auto parts that is going on between now and the 3rd of May. And then what you look at and what you're hearing from people I've talked to in the auto sector today is that if a part is made in Canada and in the United States, the automakers are just being told to use the part that's made in the United States. The long-term implications of that for part manufacturers in this country is seismic and potentially catastrophic. So while Canada dodged the larger global tariff agenda of the president yesterday, who tariffed everyone from the European Union to an island with the only inhabitants being penguins, one of the most important sectors in the national economy, certainly in the Ontario economy, is really under pressure today in a profound way. And if tariffs get applied on parts, it would apply every time they cross the border. And that makes it even more uneconomical for this industry to operate.
So it's the auto sector, aluminum and steel tariffs remain in place. And then there is still another layer of tariffs, if I'm not mistaken, that were related to the border and fentanyl.
Yes.
So those are tariffs where they fall under CUSMA. Then they will not be tariffed, but there's still a 10% tariff on energy.
Yeah, those are the 25 and 10, right? And if you're CUSMA compliant or NAFTA compliant or USMCA, whatever alphabet components you want to use, those are still held in abeyance. So there were still a bunch of companies and a bunch of products that needed to do the necessary steps to become compliant with the trade agreement to avoid those tariffs. But you can just see the disruption, the uncertainty, the shock, the on again, off again, on again, off again, stop and start approach that all of this has created. And right now, though, steel and aluminum in facing hits, losing jobs, and now auto is really in trouble.
Okay, we have some guests and others that we'll bring in as we wait for the Prime Minister of Canada, who we're already told will be late. So it probably won't be 11:30, but a little bit later. In the meantime, let's bring you a little bit of the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, because of course this is all happening on day 12 of the election campaign. Let's listen to Pierre Poilievre.
To buy a good home,
in a nice neighborhood, a safe neighborhood, protected by our brave soldiers under the proud Canadian flag.
CanCoil is the symbol of all that is great about Canada. Anju and Chandra Datta came to Canada in 1983 with nothing more than a suitcase and a dream. In fact, they were originally from India, but they had lived in the United States and decided that Canada was the place to start their lives. And they started a two-person business in a 4,000 square foot warehouse where this business began. They're now 100 times bigger. They now have 200 employees and 400,000 square foot facility to produce these incredible products, and they have built a beautiful life here in this country. We're in this to bring home the Canadian promise that anyone from anywhere can achieve anything, that hard work gets you a great life in a safe community, a beautiful house under our proud flag. That is the purpose of running for office, and is why I'm honored to be here today with the great Member of Parliament, Michael Barrett, a military veteran and Shadow Minister of Ethics, the great Brian Patterson, mayor, three-term mayor here in this community, and who will be an amazing Member of Parliament, putting Canada first and bringing change, desperately needed change, to this country. Yesterday, many Canadians watched with anger and anxiety as President Trump once again attacked our country and our jobs. Until yesterday, many Canadians, including me, still held out hope that President Trump might come to his senses and spare us of additional tariffs. Just last Friday, Mark Carney said he had a, quote, very productive, very constructive call with President Trump, citing progress. Unfortunately, Canada has not been spared. There is no progress, and there was nothing constructive or productive about Trump's tariff announcement. At midnight last night, Canada was being hit with new and completely unjustifiable tariffs on autos, in addition to the existing tariffs on lumber, steel, and aluminum. The Prime Minister also said last night that we can expect even more tariffs on our lumber, our pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and copper. Meanwhile, global markets are in turmoil. Our seniors are wondering what will happen to their savings after the tariff madness that came from the White House yesterday. Millions of Canadians woke up to the fear of losing their savings or their jobs. It's clear that tariffs must end. It's clear that Canadians must stand together. And I'm here to reassure Canadians that united, we will get through this together. We will strengthen our country and stand up for our workers. First and foremost, we must support workers and their families. So to the hardworking Canadians and businesses directly hit by these unjustified tariffs, I say, your concerns are my concern today. We are here for you. A new Conservative government will make it a priority to keep industry moving and workers working. We know that once the link between worker and job is broken, it can take months or years to rebuild it. That's why it is much more economically affordable and much more important from the well-being of a family to keep the job in place. Millions of
Canadians woke up this morning wondering what the consequences would be of Trump's attacks on them and their family. It's very simple. We have to put an end to tariffs, but in the meantime, we have to take care of ourselves. First and foremost, we have to support workers and their families. To every Canadian working hard in an industry in Canada who is affected by these tariffs, I want you to know that we share your concerns today, and we will be there for you. The priority of a Conservative government will be to protect jobs. We know that once the attachment to a job is broken for a worker, it is difficult to restore it. That is why we must keep people at work as long as possible.
We need to protect auto workers in Oshawa, Cambridge, Brampton, Windsor, Essex, St. Catharines, Oakville, Alliston, Woodstock, Ingersoll, and elsewhere. That's why I'm announcing today that a new Conservative government will eliminate the federal sales tax on Canadian-made automobiles. Everyone who's looking to buy Canadian, to support Canadian workers, will be able to save money as a result of this announcement. Axing the GST on a $50,000 Canadian-made automobile will save $2,500 to the car buyer. By saving cash-strapped Canadians' families their hard-earned money, we will increase demand for Canadian-made cars and keep more workers on the job. And I'm calling on the premiers to match our policy and remove their portion of provincial sales tax on Canadian-made automobiles. This will have the double effect of supporting workers in the auto sector and also tackling the Liberal inflation crisis that has made everything more expensive. Both federal and provincial sales taxes, were they removed, would save up to $7,000 for the purchase of the average $50,000 car. C'est pourquoi j'annonce aujourd'hui que
That's why I'm announcing today that a new Conservative government will eliminate the sales tax on all Canadian-made automobiles as long as Donald Trump's tariffs remain in place, hitting our auto sector here in Canada. Canadians show solidarity and are insisting on buying Canadian. That's why we want to make our cars more affordable by eliminating this tax. By removing it from a $50,000 car, that will cost you $2,500 less. This will allow Canadians to support workers here in Canada, right here at home, at the same time that we're saving money for our families that have already been struggling in Canada. It will mean that we can maintain the demand for Canadian-made cars, and workers can continue to have work to do. I'm inviting the premiers of the provinces and territories to adopt this proposal and, at their end, remove the sales tax. That would mean there would be a savings of $7,000 on a $50,000 car. We're able to save money for families on the one hand, families that are struggling because of Liberal inflation, but also it's a way of protecting jobs right here in Canada and putting Canada first.
It'll mean big savings. For example, on a new Chevy Silverado from the factory in Oshawa, a new Honda CR-V from Alliston, a Toyota RAV4 from Woodstock, or a new Chrysler Pacifica from Windsor, and all the other affected industries, we have your back. We will stand with you. We know that some of these plants are temporarily shut down or are closed for retooling, but we will keep them eligible if and when they do reopen, and we will continue to monitor the list of vehicles made in Canada and add and subtract automobiles from eligibility based on the Canadian content that they have. I announced yesterday as well that a Conservative government, a new Conservative government, will protect workers for a change. We will set up the Keeping Canadians Working Fund. This will be a temporary targeted loan program for businesses directly hit by Trump's tariffs to allow them to keep workers on the job until we get through this tariff madness. We will start with a fund of $3 billion. These will be loans, not expenditures, and we will use the money to lend to companies who are desperate to keep employees on the payroll throughout this period of uncertainty and tariff obstacles, so that those workers can keep working, keep paying taxes, can keep supporting their families. At the same time, I will push hard to end the tariff madness. On my first day on the job as Prime Minister, I will call the President and demand that we rapidly renegotiate the CUSMA agreement on a very tight timeline. That will allow us to find certainty. I will also propose that in the meantime, both sides suspend tariffs. To be clear, no counter tariffs from Canada will be removed unless and until the Americans do the same. But the argument to President Trump will be this: put aside the uncertainty, the job loss, and stock market crashes on both sides of the border. Pause the tariffs until we can hammer out a deal. Now, that deal will have to be in the Canadian interest. First and foremost, we will protect Canadian sovereignty. Certain things will be non-negotiable. We will protect our land, our water, our laws, our government, our culture, our language policies, and our borders will always be exclusively under our control. Second, we will demand an end to all tariffs, free trade, both ways. But third, we believe we can convince the Americans it's in their national and security interest to get a deal, because we will use all the proceeds of that deal, all of the economic benefits that flow into the federal coffers, to massively rebuild our military so that we can carry our weight and keep our continent safe. This will create a powerful incentive for Americans to say yes. But, of course, there's no guarantee with Trump. As we're learning, nobody in Canada can control Donald Trump, contrary to many of the suggestions and the unrealistic expectations that some have been setting. Which is why I have to make clear, and I will be making clear to President Trump, that any commitments we make that America wants to happen on defense, border cooperation, or market access can and will be instantaneously withdrawn if he violates any part of the agreement. We will only uphold our side of the bargain as long as he holds up his side of the bargain. That's how we create the leverage to protect against a president who changes his mind and breaks his word. Still, no one can control President Trump, and no one can predict what he will do. The only thing we can control is what we do here at home. And that's why the best way to stand up to President Trump is to make our economy stronger and more independent from the Americans. The economic plan I've been announcing throughout this election is to unleash our industry, to make it strong, self-reliant, sovereign, so that we can stand on our own 2 feet and stand up to President Trump. My plan will cut income taxes for all Canadians so hard work pays off for a change. We'll eliminate the industrial carbon tax so that we can bring back steel, manufacturing, aluminum, fertilizer, oil and gas, and other heavy industrial products that are the backbone of a modern economy. It will allow Canadians to allow tax-free reinvestment of capital gains, which means that companies can reinvest in beautiful factories that employ Canadian workers like this one. I just spoke to Chandra, who started up this place. All of this stuff, all these machines that these incredible workers operate, that is investment. The more of these machines, the more of these factories we have, the more powerful paychecks we will generate, and the more we will be independent from Trump. A tax-free reinvestment in Canada of capital gains will be like rocket fuel for our economy, allowing us to soar over the American economy. I will axe the sales tax off new homes to get more homes built and create more demand for the Canadian lumber that Donald Trump is attacking. Build Canadian homes with Canadian wood, supporting Canadian loggers and tradesmen. For the last 10 years, the Liberals have had their boot to the neck of our energy sector. But it's not dead yet, and my plan will bring it roaring back to life. I will relaunch our energy sector by repealing Liberal No New Pipelines Law C-69 and lifting the Liberal energy cap to produce more energy. Mark Carney has said he will keep the legal ban on pipelines in C-69 and that he will keep the energy cap. That is economic suicide. It is another reason why President Trump has supported Mark Carney's re-election in this campaign. Not just more pipelines, but more LNG, large-scale mines, and nuclear projects. It will send hundreds of billions of dollars If Mr. Carney goes ahead with C-69, he will be blocking pipelines, mines, nuclear plants, and other projects, sending hundreds of billions of dollars fleeing south right into the hands of Donald Trump. And it means that Western Canadians will never be able to sell their oil directly to Eastern Canadians. Instead, we'll have to keep passing our energy south at a discount and even sending energy through the American economy just to send it back to Quebec and Ontario. That is not change. That is more of the lost Liberal decade. And the choice on resources is this. After a lost Liberal decade of driving our jobs south and driving our economy under the American thumb, do the Liberals deserve a fourth term in power, or is it time to unlock our resources, bring home our jobs, and become a strong economy for a change with a new Conservative government?
The economic plan I'm presenting in this campaign is a plan to unleash our industries so that Canada is a strong and sovereign nation capable of standing up to Donald Trump's threats. We will eliminate taxes on income for all Canadians who reinvest in Canada. We will remove the carbon tax on industries, and we will do that for everyone and for always. This plan will allow people to reinvest their capital gains tax-free as long as it's invested right here in Canada. We will be masters in our own home. That means that Canadians will be able to avoid paying the government when they should be receiving a paycheck. So this will increase economic growth, and we have to give the workers the technology that they need to move forward. We will remove the sales tax on new homes to stimulate construction and use of our lumber. Over the last 10 years, the Liberals have ruined the energy by blocking projects like LNG Quebec that would have helped the aluminum and steel industries in Quebec. This would have allowed us to get around the United States to ship our resources overseas. We will also remove the cap, the energy cap the Liberals have introduced and that Mr. Carney would keep. We will eliminate C-69, the anti-development legislation, which is unconstitutional and prevents the construction of major projects across the country. Unfortunately, Mr. Carney continues to support the same economic policies that drove our economy down over the last 10 years. He does not represent change. The last thing that Donald Trump would like to see is a prime minister in Canada who will make our economy competitive and unleash development of our resources. Mr. Trump does not want us to be masters in our own home. He wants to keep Canada weak with weak economic policies. That's why he has given his support to Mark Carney. I will strengthen our economy, unleash our resources, cut red tape and taxes to reward work here in Canada. We will triumph over the challenge facing us. Canadians should be reassured that we are a strong people, a united people, and we will stand up in the face of the U.S.'s threats by putting Canada first. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. We'll now take questions from the floor.
Good morning, Mr. Poilievre. My name is Bill Hutchins with Kingstonist.com.
Hi, Bill.
How are you?
Great. How did you like our rally yesterday?
It was nice. Big crowd.
Very big. How many people do you think were there?
3,000 to 4,000.
It's pretty big. When was the last time you had that in Kingston?
It's been a while.
Yeah.
But I understand, too, that a lot of your supporters came out from across the region as well, not just this riding. So
that was nice of them in this rain. It was a rough night to drive in. I don't know. Did John A. Macdonald have crowds like that when he was the MP here?
He may have had a few crowds around City Hall back in the day. As a matter of fact, I was going to ask you about, one of the questions I'm going to ask you is about putting Sir John A.'s statue back in in Kingston and the impact that might have on Indigenous relations and truth and reconciliation. But I did want to also touch on this other question here, that experts have predicted that Kingston will be kind of shielded from the impact of the severest impact of the tariff war, partly because we're a government town. Lots of government employees, including a large military base, as you know. But you talk about slashing government jobs and bureaucracy as part of your platform. So I want to know what you would say to those anxious federal workers in this and other communities across the country. Are their jobs safe in these uncertain times?
Yes, we've said our reductions in the federal bureaucracy will be done by attrition. We have 17,000 public servants who voluntarily leave every single year, many to retire, many to accept other job opportunities, and that allows us to reduce the cost of the bureaucracy without giving out mass pink slips. I would also add that we're going to expand our military, which will be great for Kingston because of the wonderful military footprint we have here. I think we also know that there are a lot of entrepreneurs, small businesses, manufacturing businesses like this one here, Can Coil, who will benefit from my Canada First economic plan to bring home jobs. We're going to cut income tax so that workers pay 15% less to the federal government off their paycheck. That'll support local businesses who will have richer customers buying more food and more products. We'll bring in the Canada First reinvestment tax cut, zero capital gains tax on reinvested gains so that we can grow our economy. We'll get rid of the industrial carbon tax to bring back industry jobs. We will also speed up home building. There's an enormous housing shortage here in Kingston. By axing the federal sales tax on new homes and incentivizing municipalities to speed up permits, we're going to be building homes, creating jobs for carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and others. After the lost Liberal decade of rising costs and crime and a falling economy now under America's thumb, we can't afford to give Liberals a fourth term. We need a new Conservative government that will axe taxes, build homes, unleash our resources, and bring home our jobs for a change. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
The statue, I mean, I believe we should put the John A. Macdonald statue back up. I mean, you agree with that? What do you think? Look, it was John A. Macdonald who first had the vision of resisting American annexation. His entire life was dedicated to a great East-West nation. That's why he put together Confederation and why he built the railroad. An East-West railroad was designed to bind us together with iron and steel. And that's exactly what we need to do now. We need East-West pipelines, roadways, transmission lines, and other resources that will link our nation from east to west and reverse the hopeless reliance the Liberals have made us face with the Americans. You know, President Trump wants to keep our economy weak by supporting Mark Carney and keeping the Liberals in power for a fourth term. But what's good for President Trump is not what's good for Canada. We need a new government who will put Canada first for a change, and that includes standing up for and uniting around our brilliant history. And that history includes John A. Macdonald. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah. Good morning.
Hi, Abigail Beeman, CTV News. Your party has dropped 4 candidates in 2 days. How can Canadians be convinced of your vetting process for people you believe are fit to govern this country? And here in Kingston, how does that vetting process extend to Mr. Patterson for his previous connection to a church that supported conversion therapy?
Well, first of all, you omitted from your question that Mr. Patterson renounced conversion therapy years ago. And so the question is not accurate. Secondly, our vetting process is stronger than all the other parties. That's why we have a zero tolerance for anyone who acts unacceptably. This is the exact opposite of what we saw from Mr. Carney, who tried to keep on as a candidate someone who had asked for his conservative opponent to be handed over to the Chinese Communist government on a bounty to be imprisoned or maybe murdered because he was a dissident against that government. Mr. Carney said that it was a teachable moment. He's right. It taught all of us that Mark Carney will never put Canada first. He sold out. He went to China to get a $250 million loan from the Chinese government while he was Justin Trudeau's economic advisor. He met with top officials in the central bank. He met with the mayor of Beijing. He built his own profit off of compromising himself and his company. He still has those compromises because he has money, untold millions, invested in Brookfield that owes all of this money still to the government in Beijing. So how are we going to know when he's acting for Canada rather than acting for his bottom line? And that's why I reiterate my call. Your question was about vetting. Well, Canadians should be able to vet Mark Carney's conflicts of interest by having him publish all of his financial interests so that Canadians know what interests he has that go against Canada's national interests. After the lost Liberal decade of selling out our economy, driving away our resources, taxing away our jobs, we can't afford to give Liberals a fourth term. We need a new Conservative government that will bring home the jobs to this country so we can stand up for ourselves in a position of strength for a change. Thank you.
En français.
Merci beaucoup. Ça montre que nous avons
Thank you very much. That shows me that we have a good process in order to ensure the quality of our candidates, and it's quite the opposite with Mr. Carney, who tried to keep in place a candidate who encouraged people to turn over his conservative opponent to the Chinese government to be jailed or killed. Mr. Carney said he wanted to keep him as a candidate. He never removed him. And a few months after Mr. Carney went to China to receive a loan from a Chinese bank of some $250 million, well, that conflict is still in place. After I've been vetting our candidates, and I think that it's now time for Mr. Carney to disclose his own financial interests so that we know what kind of conflict there could be between Canada's interests and foreign interests, which are counter to our country.
Good morning, Sarah Rich,
Good morning.
Canadian Press.
Thank you.
Yesterday in an op-ed, Preston Manning wrote that people in Eastern Canada need to recognize, he said, that a vote for the Liberals is a vote for Western secession and a breakup of the country as we know it. Do you agree with Mr. Manning, and what do you say to people who feel that way?
No, we need to unite the country. We need to bring all Canadians together in a spirit of common ground. Let's unite our nation, because after the lost Liberal decade of blocking resource jobs, driving $500 billion out of our economy to the U.S., taxing away our workers, and selling out our country, we can't give the Liberals a fourth term in power. What we need is a new Conservative government that will unite Canadians, unleash our resource production, cut taxes on our workers and entrepreneurs so that we can bring home our jobs and stand up to President Trump from a position of strength for a change. Thank you.
En français.
Non, je suis en faveur de l'unité canadienne parce
I
qu'après
am in favor of Canadian unity because after the lost Liberal decade that divided this country, drove some $500 billion of investment to the United States, blocked our natural resources, and weakened our economy in relation to the U.S.,
Okay, that is the
have to
Conservative
change.
leader, Pierre Poilievre, talking about the decision yesterday by Donald Trump to unleash tariffs around the world, sparing a universal tariff on Canada, but moving forward with a broad-based tariff on a 25% tariff on the automobile sector in this country, and of course maintaining the tariffs that were on aluminum and steel. He says that this is not justifiable. He also said, though, that Canada has not been spared and there is no progress after the Prime Minister spoke to the President. There, of course, has been some sparing of Canada in this, given that other countries around the world are dealing with tariffs from 10% and above. Canada and Mexico spared from that for now. Pierre Poilievre also saying that he would, if elected Prime Minister, get on the phone immediately with Donald Trump and demand a very fast, rapid renegotiation of CUSMA, of the NAFTA deal, if both sides suspend tariffs. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada with the government's response. We'll talk more in a minute. Let's listen in live.
Yesterday marked the latest in President Trump's unprecedented series of U.S. tariffs that are designed to reshape the international trading system. The ambition of these measures is enormous. The effects on the global economy will be monumental. We received confirmation that the latest reciprocal tariffs will not be imposed on Canada. At the same time, President Trump confirmed that the tariffs announced last week against our auto industry will come in, and indeed have come into effect today. So while it's progress that further tariffs were not imposed on Canada yesterday, the President's actions will reverberate here in Canada and across the world. Three different sets of U.S. tariffs remain in place and will continue to pose significant threats to Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. And while they have been imposed under different premises, some things are consistent. They are all unjustified, unwarranted, and in our judgment, misguided. And we are already seeing the consequences. Just last evening, workers from Unifor Local 444, with whom I met last week, learned that their auto assembly plant in Windsor will be shutting down for at least the next 2 weeks. That's 3,600 workers who are now out of work, not by their choice. Workers who now worry how they're going to put food on the table and pay their bills. I and my government stand in solidarity with those workers in Windsor and all those workers hurt by President Trump's tariffs. And that's why we committed from the very start that all, and I repeat, all of our tariff proceeds will go to protect workers affected by the tariffs. Les premiers tarifs ont été annoncés en février.
The initial tariffs were announced in February. After a brief pause, they were put back in place in March. According to the Trump administration, they were put in place in relation to fentanyl traffic over our common border. The fact is that 0.1% of fentanyl going into the United States comes from Canada. And in spite of that, the U.S. government has, the Canadian government has introduced a vigorous plan of $2.3 billion to strengthen the border. This is a plan that provides new tools to our police forces, helicopters, drones, and canine teams to prevent the trafficking of fentanyl and other products across our border.
That plan is working. As U.S. Customs and Border Protection themselves have acknowledged, there was a 97% drop in fentanyl seized at our shared border in January compared to December. In fact, Canada was not mentioned once in the United States annual report that lists the biggest threat to that country. Just last night, The U.S. Senate made it clear that these tariffs are a mistake. The Senate voted to repeal them in a symbolic but important assertion of both fact and solidarity. The second set of U.S. tariffs were imposed in March on steel and aluminum imports from around the world, including Canada. Canada has long been the United States' main supplier of these materials, materials that are vital to building Americans' homes, their cars, their bridges, their consumer goods, and so much more. These materials are vital to powering America's economy. The President pursued similar tariffs on steel and aluminum during his first term, a process which led to thousands of lost jobs in America. Then, as now, those tariffs were in clear violation of trading agreements. Today it's CUSMA, an agreement that the President himself negotiated and promoted during his first term, an agreement that we in Canada have upheld in good faith. Last week, the President and his administration announced their third set of tariffs, this time against auto imports primarily from Mexico and Canada. In the year I was born, Canada and the United States signed the Auto Pact, an agreement that ended auto tariffs between our nations and began a 60-year period, you can guess my age, a 60-year period of close cooperation, partnership, job growth, and prosperity. And that era has now ended unless the United States and Canada can agree on a new comprehensive approach. Yesterday's actions by the U.S. administration, while not specifically targeting Canada, will rupture the global economy and adversely affect global economic growth. The global economy is fundamentally different today than it was yesterday. The system of global trade anchored on the United States that Canada has relied on since the end of the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for our country for decades, is over. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. Well, this is a tragedy. It is also the new reality. We must respond with both purpose and force. We are a free, sovereign, and ambitious country. We are masters in our own home. Nous sommes maîtres chez nous. Nous contrôlons.
We are masters in our own home, and we control our destiny. We will choose our own path forward, and we will protect and fight. We will fight these tariffs until they are removed. We will protect our workers and businesses during that difficult period. And we will build a Canadian economy that is strong. We will build Canada strong.
We will fight to bring each of these tariffs to an end. We're fighting in courts, challenging that these tariffs have been illegally imposed under U.S. law. We have filed disputes underscoring that they are in violation of our free trade agreement, CUSMA. We have gone to the World Trade Organization because these actions are against international trade law. We are responding today with, and we have responded throughout, with carefully calibrated and targeted counter tariffs. Yesterday,
I met with my U.S.-Canada Relations Council, and I had a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. relations yesterday as well. I also invited the premiers to attend a meeting for a third time. We are united. We are determined.
As I told President Trump during our call last week, Canada will respond to the U.S. auto tariffs. And today I'm announcing that the Government of Canada will be responding by matching the U.S. approach, with 25% tariffs on all vehicles imported from the United States that are not compliant with CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement, and on the non-Canadian content of CUSMA-compliant vehicles from the United States as well. Our tariffs, though, unlike the U.S. tariffs, will not affect auto parts because we know the benefits of our integrated production system. And they will also not affect vehicle content from Mexico, who is respecting the CUSMA agreement. And as well, we are developing a framework for auto producers in Canada to get relief from these counter tariffs as long as they maintain their production and investment in our country. Importantly, every single dollar raised from those counter tariffs, our counter tariffs, which could reach around $8 billion before remission, will go directly to our auto workers and the companies affected by those tariffs. And that's on top of a $2 billion fund that we announced last week to build a made-in-Canada auto sector, a fund that a new Liberal government would implement should we be elected. Nos droits de douane n'affecteront pas les pièces automobiles.
Our tariffs will not affect auto parts because we know the benefits of our integrated production system, nor will they affect vehicle content from Mexico. At the same time, we are developing a framework for auto producers to avoid our counter tariffs as long as they maintain their production and their investments in Canada. It is important to note that every single dollar raised, approximately $8 billion before remission, from these tariffs will go directly to our auto workers and the companies affected by these tariffs. That is on top of the $2 billion fund to build a new made-in-Canada auto sector that I announced that a new Liberal government would implement should we be elected.
Our retaliatory tariffs that we previously announced in response to the United States' other tariffs will remain in effect. You know, we take these measures reluctantly, and we take them in ways that it's intended and will cause maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. And we should be aware that the President and his administration have also signaled that tariffs will be applied on what the Americans term as strategic sectors: pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, and agriculture. In
the coming days and weeks, we will make it clear to our U.S. counterparts that this would be a mistake. And that we will make a calibrated and energetic response to any new tariffs, because the time has come to renegotiate our partnership with the United States.
As President Trump and I agreed last week, he and the Prime Minister of Canada will sit down immediately following the election to find areas of common ground and agreement in a new economic and security partnership. I told the President that I will be working hard for the next month to earn the right to represent Canada in those discussions to get the best deal for Canada under the new U.S. approach. At the same time, Canada must be looking elsewhere to expand our trade, to build our economy, and to protect our sovereignty. Canada is ready to take a leadership role in building a coalition of like-minded countries who share our values. We believe in international cooperation. We believe in the free and open exchange of goods, services, and ideas. And if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will. Canada is strengthening our trading relationships with reliable partners. Earlier
this week, I spoke to the Mexican President, Ms. Sheinbaum, and today I had discussions with the German Chancellor. I have had many conversations with the President of the European Commission, Madame van der Leyen. And my first week in this job gave me a chance to meet with the Prime Minister of the UK and the French President, Emmanuel Macron. We are all opposed to the American government's approach, and we are all in favor of free and equitable trading.
My government understands that Canadians hurt by the unjustified tariffs will need our support. And to our workers producing sustainable, high-quality lumber in Smithers, Prince George, and Elmsdale, to our workers extracting oil and gas around Fort McMurray and in northeastern BC, aux travailleurs dans les alumineries
to workers
du Saguenay,
in aluminum smelters in the Saguenay,
Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, et La Bosse, to our workers at auto assembly plants in Windsor, Ingersoll, and Oakville, to all our workers who might be worried about their next paycheck and their futures, the federal government will do everything in our power to protect you and your careers. In this new world, we have to look out for ourselves, and because we are Canadian, we will always look out for each other. La semaine dernière,
last week, I announced a number of targeted measures to support workers and businesses directly affected by this trade war brought on by President Trump. For workers, we have removed the one-week waiting period for employment insurance. We have also ensured that they won't have to exhaust their other benefits. Before they can access employment insurance, and we have facilitated access to employment insurance. As I've said and repeated, my government will use every single dollar to support Canadian workers as long as this trade war continues. We will also support Canadian businesses. We have postponed tax payments as well as GST and HST remittances for businesses. We have introduced new measures to provide them liquidity and financial assistance that will help our businesses to get through this storm. And we have also increased the funding of regional development agencies.
Fighting back against U.S. tariffs and protecting our workers are our most immediate priorities. But they are not sufficient. Our task as a nation in the coming weeks and months and years is to think bigger and to act bigger. We can draw strength right now from each other. From Canadians who are supporting local businesses, Canadians who are buying Canadian, Canadians who are changing their travel plans, and Canadians who are helping each other as neighbors. We are powerful when we act together. From providing refuge to stranded passengers in Gander to fighting forest fires in California, Canadians have done extraordinary things for Americans when they needed it most. Now, more than ever, we need to do extraordinary things for ourselves. We will need to do things previously thought impossible at speeds we haven't seen in generations. Breaking down internal trade barriers so that we can have one Canadian economy, not 13. Making Canada more productive and competitive. Building things in this country again. Millions more homes. Building clean and conventional energy. Building more public transport, more mines, more assembly lines. Building new trade corridors with reliable partners. Building a Canada that works for everyone. A Canada that everyone can afford. a Canada worthy of its people. Last week, I met a teacher from Glen Williams Public School in Georgetown, Ontario. And she told me about a routine assignment, that she had given to her 9- and 10-year-olds. And the children were asked to describe their dreams for Canada. So some kids wrote about a country free of poverty, others dreamt of clean air and water, or a place where everyone enjoyed equal rights, dignity, and respect. These are what we all want for ourselves and for each other. But many also wrote about tariffs and threats to our sovereignty, words that I hadn't met at that age. And I'm going to quote one which is representative. I dream of a safe, a kind, and a clean Canada. A Canada that is not the U.S. Our children should be able to dream about a positive future, not worry about an economic crisis. Les Canadiens et Canadiennes sont inquiets.
Canadians are worried, and that is perfectly normal when there are big changes happening. But we are not the ones that have changed. We have remained the same reliable and proud people. We are living in a new world now, and that comes with new challenges.
Given the prospective damage to their own people, the American administration should eventually change course. But I don't want to give false hope. The President believes that what he is doing is best for the American economy. He believes that it's best for American workers. And although their policy will hurt American families, until that pain becomes impossible to ignore, I do not believe they will change direction. So the road to that point may indeed be long. And it will be hard on Canadians, just as it will be on other partners of the United States. It will require us to make difficult choices. It will require sacrifices. I have no doubt we will rise to the challenge, because that's who we are as Canadians. We have done hard, seemingly impossible things throughout our history. We conquered the unconquerable at Vimy and Juno Beach. Nous avons bâti un pays qui unit des langues, des cultures,
we have built a country with different languages and culture and beliefs, and in the process we became stronger.
We confronted our own past with Indigenous peoples. We answered the call to defeat fascism. We know we are not always perfect, but we always strive to be good. We do not do things because they're easy, but because they are right. We will rise to meet this challenge, and we will emerge stronger. So to those kids at Glen Williams Public School, don't worry. With your spirit, with that of your parents, their friends, and people like them across this great country, all pulling for Canada, we will build an even better Canada for your future, because that's who we are. We are Canada. Canada strong, Canada fort. Thank you very much. Merci. I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Bonjour tout le monde. We'll now start with the press conference. We'll take 15 minutes of questions, one question, one follow-up. On a 15 minutes, une question, et suivi. Laurence.
Merci.
Bonjour, Monsieur Carney. Laurence Martin
Hello,
de
Mr. Carney, Radio-Canada.
Il n'y a pas eu de recul, vous l'avez dit, il n'y a pas eu de recul de Monsieur Trump sur les
Mr. Trump did not back down on the other tariffs announced for Canada. Does that mean that your call with President Trump last week was not as productive as all that? Well, you are right. As I have just said, there is no change with respect to the fentanyl, aluminum, and steel and auto tariffs. The call with President Trump allowed us to make progress. You can see that now with the result on reciprocal tariffs. We had the best agreement of the best result in relation to a whole series of bad results. But the President and I agreed that soon there will need to be comprehensive discussions on the economic and security partnership with the United States. So that as well is progress, because you cannot make progress on every initiative or every issue. It has to be a comprehensive discussion between two sovereign countries.
You're absolutely right. The core tariffs with respect to fentanyl, automobiles, steel and aluminum remain in place. With respect to an enormous series of trade measures that were announced yesterday, we have the best deal of a series of tough deals, bad deals in many respects. That is progress. That is recognizing the partnership. As well, what was also progress in the call the President and I had last week is this agreement that we will sit down, future Prime Minister and him as President will sit down and begin negotiations on the overall economic and security partnership with Canada. And that's important, in my judgment, because we will not make progress on individual items. We can only make progress as a whole in a relationship that is being redefined. And of course, as I said in my remarks, and as I said to the President, and as I said at the time, I'm working hard to ensure, or to earn the right, rather, to earn the right to represent Canada at those negotiations.
And are you planning to coordinate your response with other countries? No, not at this time. To be clear, we have had discussions, and I have already had a number of discussions with chiefs of government in Europe and Mexico and around the world. And these are positive discussions. We have talked about how we can enhance our relations between ourselves and those countries. It's not about a negative or coordinated response to the United States. Your predecessor, Justin Trudeau, had invited the other leaders to meetings to show that Canada is fully united against Mr. Trump. Why are you pausing your election campaign? You say this is a non-partisan issue, so why don't you do what Mr. Trudeau did by scheduling a call or a meeting with the other party leaders? The other party leaders are kept informed of our response. With respect to coordination or of the Canadian response, I've had a number of discussions with the premiers of the provinces and territories, both bilateral and group discussions, as well as with union leaders, with Indigenous leaders, CEOs, and so on. There has been a great deal of consultation and coordination, and we have a Canadian team here in Canada working on this. Now, today's meeting with the premiers of the provinces and territories was fantastic in a sense because we are all fully aligned.
À ma question, mais je vais aller sur un autre sujet, la gestion de l'œuvre. Vous avez dit que vous voulez protéger la gestion de l'œuvre. You said that you want to protect
supply management, but are you pledging that if you become Prime Minister in the next government, that you will bring in a bill to really ensure that supply management cannot be part or sacrificed in a future trade agreement, and just as the previous government had voted in favor of that. Are you making that same pledge? Well, I want to begin by saying that we're talking about a new government, so there will be changes. A new prime minister, a new government. And with respect to negotiations with the United States, on January 1st or mid-January, when I launched my campaign for the Liberal leadership, I clearly stated that supply management and the French language and culture will never, ever be on the table. That is a red line, a clear line. And the President and myself did not discuss that during our call.
Good morning, Tonda McCharles, Toronto Star. Could you please expand and be specific on what you mean by an economic and security agreement? Is that a new CUSMA, or is that some other deal that renegotiates NORAD or some other broader security agreement?
So it's, from our perspective, if I may, that there have been so many, I would say from our perspective as government, my personal perspective, also from the perspective of workers, businesses, investors, Canadians, there have been so many violations, outright violations of CUSMA. There's supposed to be, I'll give you one example, one of many examples, but for steel and aluminum, there's an explicit side letter in CUSMA which says that there needs to be 60-day consultations for any changes. That obviously was not the case. There are many other examples of this. There have been so many of these violations that there is a need to have a renegotiation and a reaffirmation of which elements of the commercial relationship, the trading relationship, stand. Now, they may change, given the objectives of the United States. They may change, given, in fact, I think they will change from our perspective as well, in terms of what we need to do that's best for Canada, given the new U.S. position on so many things. As well, it is sensible, in my judgment, that we also discuss defense and security partnership. We have a long-standing defense and security partnership. Some of that partnership is for security, but it's also a commercial relationship. And we want to make sure that commercial relationship works for Canada. I will observe that 80%, 80 cents on every dollar that we spend on military equipment in its broadest sense goes to the United States. In the current stance of the relationship, that doesn't make sense. So we want to sit down and have everything on the table and have that discussion, everything on the table within commercial, subject to my previous response to the last question.
So I understand that not to be all balled up in one agreement, separate agreements, but in the future negotiation then, I want to understand what you take from President Trump's 12% reciprocal tariff, sort of that he has hanging over Canada, even if he lifts the border tariffs you call unjustified.
So I think there are several things, if I may, and it's hard to predict all elements of this, but there's certain sectors in the North American economy, the Canadian-U.S. economy, that fundamentally rely on the integration in those sectors. There's no better example of this than in autos, where it literally has been built up over my entire lifetime. And that the competitive threat in North America is from Asia, not within North America. And it will become our judgment, and the judgment, I would say, of virtually everybody who works in the auto industry, virtually everyone, not everyone, not the UAW apparently, but I think they're going to find out, that this is going to damage the U.S. auto industry as well as the Canadian auto industry. And it's going to damage the industry relative to competition from Asia. So when there's that discussion, the question, part of the discussion is going to be, how do we put back together elements of that integration? And if it's not going to come, how are we going to act in Canada? And we're going to do this, elements of this anyways, if my government is is elected, which is to build a true Made in Canada strategy that makes us much more resilient with the U.S. So, Tonda, I can't pre-wire all those discussions, but what I know is that trying to have a discussion, given the scale of ambition of the United States, given all the measures they've taken, not just against Canada, but against the whole world, that we are not going to make progress if we try to focus on only one issue. We need to reset the overall relationship. We need to set the boundaries around that, where we're going to work together, reestablish confidence, first and foremost for Canadian workers and their families, so that they know where their careers are, where their jobs are, and then more broadly for investors in business. Okay? Thank you.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Jillian Piper with Global News. Are you planning to have another phone call with President Donald Trump to discuss these tariffs?
If it's appropriate, we will. We agreed that we would, when we last spoke, that we would talk as needed over the coming weeks. So it may happen. There's not one scheduled, and as I said, I'll just reiterate, when we spoke, I did advise the President that we would be retaliating against the auto tariffs. We were going to wait to see what happened with these reciprocal tariffs that were announced yesterday. We have taken a very focused, calibrated response, balanced response, one that creates incentives for the automakers. So as appropriate, we will speak. I'm very conscious, we're very conscious that there are additional measures likely to come in other sectors, including forest products, pharmaceuticals, and others.
You said previously that the relationship that Canada had with the United States is now over. Is the U.S. still our ally?
The U.S. Absolutely. Look, the U.S. is absolutely our ally. It's our ally in security and defense partnerships. It's our most important security ally. For example, it's still, even with these tariffs, the largest trading partners. The point I made last week, the point I made again today, is part of what our relationship has been based on, though, has been a degree of integration between our economies, our trade becoming closer and closer together. That is over. I mean, we saw that that was ending a while ago. It's now emphatic. I think the world is learning that that is over. That creates real challenges for us. We're not sugarcoating it. We're absolutely clear about that. It also, though, creates an enormous opportunity for a country like Canada, which has virtually everything that the world wants, has a lot of things that the U.S. wants, and they're going to find out how much they want it with these tariffs. So we have virtually everything the world wants. And when I talk to leaders in Europe, when I talk to the Mexican president, they want to work with us. They want to cooperate with us. And I'll say one other thing, if I may, and then hand, which is one of the things, and I'll go back to Team Canada, Premier Smith, Premier Moe, Monsieur le Premier Ministre Legault, all of those premiers in the very short term either have just gone on major trade initiatives to Europe in some cases, or about to go to trade missions in Asia. That's the Team Canada approach. That's the coordinated approach that we need. And I think Canadians, again, not sugarcoating the challenges, but can be very encouraged about the sense of purpose and action at different levels to move forward. Enfin, les alliés ou oui, les États-Unis, bien sûr, les États-Unis.
Yes, of course. The United States is still Canada's ally. The United States is the most important ally we have when it comes to defense and security, but the world is changing.
Ashley Burke, CBC News. Good morning. You have talked about this, the old relationship when it comes to the tight military and security cooperation being over. So what exactly are you picturing, and what does that mean for NORAD?
Well, first and foremost, what I've emphasized has been the commercial relationship, the trading relationship, and the direction of that relationship. It was only a few months ago that many responded to the initial U.S. tariffs and discussions of tariffs by saying, this was not me, to be clear, but some prominent Canadians said, well, we should have a customs union with the United States. We should become closer to the United States. It's clear that that strategy has tremendous risks, would be misguided, in my view, and misguided and create tremendous risks. There may be certain sectors where that's the case, but as an overall approach, that view, that relationship's over. As I just said, our military and security relationship is still, with the United States, is still our most important one, without question. So I didn't declare the end of that, and I'm not declaring the end of that. What I have emphasized, and my government has taken action on, is diversifying and reinforcing other aspects of our security partnership. So we signed a major defense agreement with Australia, over the Horizon Radar. My trips to Paris and London were partly about deepening our security partnerships with those countries. We're looking on diversification in terms of maritime procurement and other aspects of procurement. We're reviewing the F-35 fighters to make sure that that's the right approach for the country going forward, given the other considerations.
Last question.
Yeah.
You've talked about how long and hard the road could be for Canadians if Mr. Trump keeps these tariffs in place. How long and hard, and is Canada headed towards a recession? Well,
look, I think it starts with what the implications of these tariffs, yesterday's tariffs, which affect all economy, virtually every economy in the world, means for the global economy and the U.S. economy, and the U.S. economy which is slowing, U.S. economy where inflation is starting to pick up, where financial conditions are going to start to tighten, and a U.S. economy which has a possibility of tipping into recession themselves. So it starts there. It is usually the case that when the United States has a recession, that it's very difficult for Canada to avoid something similar. There's been exceptions to that. With the financial crisis, 2008-9, when I was governor, we avoided a recession. We need to take action now for short-term support and reimagine our economy for the medium term. And I won't go through the list of things. You personally have had to hear them a few times, but it is about that one Canadian economy, and it's about building everything from homes to new energy infrastructure to new ports and trade infrastructure. By doing that, and by doing that in a way that is as coordinated and impactful and immediate as possible, we create a real possibility, in fact, probability. It's not just right for the medium term, but it's right for the short term. And that, in many ways, is what's at stake right now. Yes, we have to respond to the U.S., and we are responding appropriately. Yes, absolutely, first and foremost, protect our workers. But we need to do much more than that, which is to build this economy. And in doing that, we can avoid the slowdown that is coming. Well, we can do better than the United States. That's my point. We can do better than the United States. Exactly where that comes out depends on how much damage they do to their economy.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes.
En français, sur le dernier aspect, en ce qui concerne le taux de croissance à l'échelle globale.
With respect to the global growth rate, certainly the American tariffs will harm the global economy, and particularly the U.S. economy. At this point, the U.S. economy is slowing down, and the costs are going up, so that's a very tough combination for them. But that is before further major tariffs. So normally, there is a strong slowing of the Canadian economy, but in 2008 we avoided that when I was Governor of the Bank of Canada, and we can reduce the negative impact or the negative spin-offs here in Canada with strength, with economic force, and all our proposals to build a strong Canada.
Sorry, we're done. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, merci. Thank you.
Okay. That is the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, also, of course, the Liberal leader in this context, because there is an election campaign unfolding, but there is also a trade war that the President of the United States has launched right around the world as of yesterday. Today was about Canada's response to what the United States did, given that there is now, this happened overnight, a 25% tariff put on automobiles in Canada and going from Canada to the U.S. There's also tariffs remaining
on aluminum and steel, and the energy sector at a lesser percentage. So this was the Prime Minister's first opportunity to talk about that, saying that all of these tariffs, the thing they have in common, there's three groupings of them, are unjustified, unwarranted, and misguided. And he said that Canada will respond, matching the U.S. approach of 25% tariffs on vehicles imported that are not compliant under USMCA or CUSMA. That the tariffs will not affect auto parts in order to make it a little bit easier for the very integrated auto sector to continue, and will not affect vehicle content from Mexico, which he pointed out is compliant still under the free trade agreement. But he went on in a much broader way about where he thinks this relationship is going, saying that if he were to be elected Prime Minister, he does want to have a much broader negotiation with the United States, and saying that for him, it is clear that if the United States has walked away from its leadership role in the world, Canada will seek out other countries who share, quote, our values. And if the U.S. no longer wants to lead, Canada will. So I want to talk about that, and we'll go back to what Pierre Poilievre said, because he also today put on the table some ideas about how to confront Donald Trump, which of course has become the central issue of this election campaign so far. But let me bring in David Cochrane, the host of Power and Politics. We've got other reporters lined up. We'll bring them in as well. But first, your take on what we heard there. What the Prime Minister says is a measured approach to what the United States did yesterday.
Yeah. The counter tariffs amount to about $8 billion. Right. So that stacks on top of what's about $60 billion of counter tariffs in relation to the other measures. So about $69 billion, excuse me, not million, in tariffs here. All of that money, by the way, Mark Carney saying will go directly to the workers and companies that are directly affected by this, that this will not be a windfall for the government because they will collect this revenue. It will be used to support the people who are losing their jobs. Some sobering statements there, I thought, Rosie, about essentially the auto pact is over, CUSMA is over, and essentially the era of U.S. global leadership is more or less over. And he says, while this is a tragedy, it is also the new reality. And a warning to Canadians that this is not going to be short-lived, that the president believes that what he is doing in the face of all of the evidence, the stock market tanking today, jobs being lost on both sides of the border, he warns, Mark Carney does, that until the pain becomes unbearable, he believes Donald Trump will persist. So he says this will hurt and it will require sacrifice. And then it's also going to require, as he sees it and as Pierre Poilievre sees it, a conversation about a fundamental reset in the entire Canada-U.S. relationship on how the trade agreement works, how the security arrangement works, how defense integration and defense procurement work. So he is laying on the table the immediate response, the big picture assessment of where he sees the Canadian economy, the Canada-U.S. relationship going, outlining the issues that whoever wins this election will have to deal with when it is all over, and also putting defense spending there on the table as a card that Canada can use, that 80% of the current defense procurement goes to the United States. And with the way things are happening right now, he just says that doesn't make sense in the current relationship. So, those I think are the highlights of what Mark Carney had to say on what's a pretty somber and grim news conference.
Yeah, both he and Pierre Poilievre saying they want to renegotiate something. I would say that we have a much more detailed, a complete picture of what Mark Carney wants to renegotiate with the U.S. president if he's reelected. And we're just starting to get a better sense of what Pierre Poilievre is going to do, but that as well is the same approach. Let me bring in a few more people here to help us unravel a little bit what we heard and where we're at. Kate McKenna, Peter Armstrong, and Katie Nicholson, thank you all for being here. Peter, maybe I'm going to just bring you in just to get a sense of where the markets stand after this has now happened. Mark Carney saying, obviously, as David said there, that this is going to be a long road and it will be hard. But he also seemed to suggest that while the United States will find itself in a recession, we might be able to fare a little bit better if, we go ahead and do the kinds of things that he's putting on the table.
Yeah, look, I think the argument there is that there are clear and obvious things that the Canadian economy can do to spur on growth that we have had. I think a lot of people in Canadian industry will say for the last 10 years, there have been some pretty clear shackles on growth in the Canadian industries, specifically the resource industries, and that by removing those, we can see some growth. And that if we sort of do that and use some of these, interprovincial stuff, I know that's not always as much as people like to say it is, but if you can make some changes and pile those up, they can start to stack up and make up for the loss in GDP that we're going to see as a result of the tariffs with the United States. It's kind of like you can kind of reverse engineer and say, okay, we've got a hole that's going to be whatever it is, 5.4% of GDP in Q2. Well, what can we do to fill that hole with other things? And it's going to be clunky and it's not going to be good for anybody. But there are easy ways, not easy, but there are clear ways that I think steps that Canada can take that can address those holes and can address that drop in GDP. That I think there's pretty widespread acceptance and enthusiasm for in Canada right now.
Let me bring Katie Nicholson, who is in Washington for us right now. Katie, obviously the world has woken up to respond to a global trade war. A piece of it is hitting Canada in a much smaller way, and Mark Carney did acknowledge that, but it doesn't matter. The damage will be done to the auto sector, and so Canada now retaliating on that front as well, which will create problems. I think Canada is trying to minimize how much it would affect the integrated industry, but that's where the response is. Give me a sense of what you're seeing and hearing globally to the actions the president took yesterday.
I mean, it's been really a sort of a chaotic response from Asia to Europe as everybody's sort of woken up to this reality today. And, Americans here are waking up to job losses. So look at the 900 jobs that were lost at the Stellantis sort of setup here. So it's very quickly sort of mounting on the administration. And we have seen members of Team Trump out there on all of the morning shows today really trying to push this hard line on tariffs, the true believers out there saying, really minimizing actually the short-term pain they're saying that Americans are going to feel and pushing towards their end goal, which is to sort of increase manufacturing here, to bring people in here, a new heyday of manufacturing within the United States of America. And it's almost breathtaking to sort of hear the White House press secretary really struggle to answer those questions about people who are already struggling here in this country with issues of affordability, and speaking to the markets directly, saying trust in President Trump, just trust in this plan. And then you have Howard Lutnick, you have Scott Bessent, everybody sort of saying, no, this is going to work. This is going to bring in a brand new golden era for this country. When the reality is, I mean, you go out in Washington, you talk to people here, restaurants. I'll throw to an Italian restaurant I went to yesterday, chatting with people there. They are importing most of the materials there from Italy, now hit with a 20% tariff. How are they going to be able to sort of mitigate that? This is a real concern. They already are dealing with thin margins. So the fallout of this, it's drastic. We're seeing the markets here fall, crater. We are seeing the American dollar take a hit as well. And this is still playing out. And yet you get this sense from the White House, they are just going to keep going on this. They are not going to blink. They are not going to buckle. In fact, Howard Lutnick just a little while ago was on CNN saying that they are not going to back down on this. I think there was some suggestion previously, the president will look at the markets, and if he sees the markets have an adverse reaction, he's going to blink and he's going to step back a little bit. They are right now still sticking to this idea that no, they are going to move ahead with this and nothing is going to change. So come what may. And certainly things are starting to hit hard now with job losses.
Okay, Katie Nicholson in Washington, thank you so much for that. Let me bring in Kate McKenna, who's also been listening in through both the Prime Minister and the Conservative leaders' actions and speech this morning. Mr. Carney saying, Kate, that this is the best outcome of a series of bad results. But as Katie says, they're not something that the President seems to be reconsidering. What did you make of what the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister put in the window today in terms of how to help, particularly the auto sector, immediately, because they're going to start feeling the pain of this quite quickly?
Well, there was some alignment. Both Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney say that they would want to renegotiate CUSMA as quickly as possible. But Pierre Poilievre announced a similar promise to what the NDP said earlier, which is that he would, if elected, eliminate federal sales tax on Canadian-made vehicles. He also announced specific help for workers. He put a dollar figure on a fund that he proposed yesterday, a $3 billion fund, which would be targeted loans for businesses affected by tariffs to keep Canadians working. That's a little bit different than what Mark Carney has said so far. Both of them pledging support for workers, of course, but Mark Carney said, last week they announced targeted measures that include removing the wait for employment insurance, postponing tax payments for businesses affected, and introducing new measures to give businesses financial help to help them get through this window of time. So two slightly different visions when it comes to helping workers who might be affected. But Pierre Poilievre has really put kind of meat on the bone of what his plan would be if he is elected to take on Donald Trump, saying that not only would he renegotiate CUSMA, but he would also seek to, when renegotiating it, first get Donald Trump to take off the tariffs on Canada that are currently existing, and in exchange, Canada would do the same for the reciprocal tariffs that are already in place, and then try and use Canada use what we sell to the United States as leverage in trade negotiations in case Donald Trump starts violating CUSMA again or whatever the next trade deal would be. It's not clear how Pierre Poilievre would be able to convince Donald Trump of that. Obviously, they have a much larger market than we do at this time, but his number one economic message has been throughout this campaign that Canada needs to build itself up. It needs to grow its infrastructure. It needs to become economically resilient, particularly as it comes to resources. So getting more resource projects off the ground, getting a west to east pipeline so we don't have to rely on the United States to move crude oil. That has been sort of the backbone of his response. And it is worth noting that's something that he's been preaching, that he's been promising for years now, even before the Donald Trump threats. So we've seen some of that language also from Mark Carney. There's a lot of alignment between both the Liberals and the Conservatives on how Donald Trump, how they would handle Donald Trump if elected Prime Minister, but slightly competing visions as well.
Okay, Kate. Yeah, there's alignment, and yet there are differences too. There are contrast points, which is obviously even more important during an election. That's Natasha Fattah. We'll go to David Cochrane. We'll come back to Natasha when we're done. Hi, Natasha. One of the things that struck me that Pierre Poilievre, because I do think we've talked about how there are people who are trying to push him to talk more about Donald Trump. He is in some ways resisting and in some ways not, saying that my campaign is focused on issues that matter to Canadians, of cost of living, affordability, but he is talking more about Donald Trump. Today, he certainly did. He, in fact, is using some of the language that Mark Carney himself has been using for a couple of weeks now, saying, quote, no one can control Donald Trump. That's a Carney line. And this issue around the federal sales tax on cars, this is something the NDP put forward a week ago. But, yeah, I mean, he's talking about it more, and he seems to think that this, as Kate was alluding to, this economic fortress that he believes he could put in place in Canada would be a way to protect the country against Donald Trump. He's saying all these things, of course, as the Prime Minister is allowed to act on things.
Sure.
And that is a very challenging position for Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, and you're seeing sort of rhetorical contrast and also a contrast in approach and priorities between the two leaders today. For example, a small thing just to start with, the phone call between Mark Carney and Donald Trump on Friday, which led to a shift in tone, which Mark Carney says led to progress because there were no reciprocal tariffs applied today, but which Pierre Poilievre says there was no progress because here we are, we still have the existing ones. But it's interesting that Tim Houston, the Premier of Nova Scotia, issued a statement last night thanking Mark Carney for his leadership and saying that your approach seems to be working as we have collectively noticed derogatory messages have
Conservative
stopped.
Premier.
Yeah, a Conservative Premier, progressive Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia in a province where the federal Conservatives have an opportunity to grow, but where there is not much of a relationship with the provincial government. So progress, no progress. That's the first contrast point today. The other is how they would approach this renegotiation of either CUSMA or the broader economic and security relationship with the United States. Pierre Poilievre says this is a thing he'd make the phone call on day one and start the talks, but only if the tariffs are dropped. Mark Carney doesn't have that condition on the table and laid out that, in his view, that would not be a realistic thing to expect if you want to start this conversation quickly, because Donald Trump is committed to this. Donald Trump believes in this. He is tanking his stock market, his economy, and disrupting global trade because he believes this is the best path to repatriate manufacturing at a scale to bring us back, the U.S. back to the glory days of the 1880s, I suppose, is that's the era he keeps citing. So there's a contrast point there, the precondition for the conversation and the practicality of putting a condition on the table when it is so central to what the U.S. president wants to do. And then the last contrast point I would point out is what they're going to do with the tariff revenue.
Yes.
Pierre Poilievre says it will be a blend of direct aid to workers and to companies who are affected by this, but also tax cuts for the broader Canadian public who will be dealing with higher prices. Mark Carney saying 100% of it goes into tariff, goes into support for the workers. So, there's a difference in how you do that there because, is a tax cut temporary or is it permanent? I know the GST holiday that Pierre Poilievre was talking about in Canadian-made vehicles, which I'm told would apply to about 400,000 cars a year. That would last for as long as the tariffs are in place. So that's not the type of tax cut he's talking about as a permanent thing. Is that a tariff revenue thing? I don't know. But 100% aid to workers in industry versus a blend of tax cuts and aid. The reality is, and this is a point Chuck Todd made, the former host of Meet the Press on my show last night, and I've heard this from senior members of the cabinet and the administration here in Canada, that you're dealing with a 78-year-old man who can't seek re-election. So Donald Trump politically has nothing to lose here.
Well, so he says.
Legally,
yes,
constitutionally, he can.
For now, yes.
So that gives him a lot of runway if his pain tolerance is high when it comes to economic devastation. So it's really those midterm elections that we get into in 2026 that becomes a major inflection point and a pressure point there, because it gives the Democrats an opportunity to take back control of the House, take back control of the Senate, and that is the next real political pressure point beyond, where unemployment and the stock market goes. So that's the type of runway you could be facing in terms of when Donald Trump might be forced to move off of this, Congress taking back its control of trade and tariffs, or just becoming too politically untenable for him.
Though it certainly sounded like Mark Carney believes that there's no change in heart coming for the president anytime soon, is saying, I don't believe they will change direction, and really trying to, I think, set expectations for Canadians about where this is going to go and how long this may be and how painful it will be.
Certainly not by May, when whoever wins this election will be installed or taking control.
This is a long-term problem. And we already know that there are some layoffs that have happened. Katie Nicholson talked about some in the United States. Well, some have happened overnight here in this country as well. Jennifer LaGrassa joins us from Windsor now, where Stellantis has laid off people overnight and shut the plant for, I think, 2 weeks. Jennifer LaGrassa, what can you tell us about what has unfolded there in the past 12 hours or so?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a lot of uncertainty here. I'm standing outside of Stellantis's Windsor assembly plant, and it employs, thousands of people in this region. And late last night, 3,200 workers learned that as of Monday, they don't need to come in. So Stellantis is pausing production for 2 weeks. They said that, the main driver behind this is U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs, that 25% tariff that he will be enforcing on those foreign-made vehicles, which applies to the value of all non-American content in the vehicles. Parts, as we know, imported under that Canada-U.S. trade agreement are tariff-free, at least for now. So when asked about this earlier today at a conference, Ontario Premier Doug Ford had this to say.
I've mentioned my concerns to the CEO of Stellantis and how we need to have this plant up and going, which it should be up and going. And I've been saying this over and over again, a tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans. I mentioned Termination Day. There's a perfect example. That's just one company, one sector, not to mention all the other sectors.
So we're going to be hearing from the union for these workers here. That's Unifor Local 444 this afternoon. But on social media, the union has said that there are more scheduled changes that are expected to come in the coming weeks. They also said that these tariffs have and continue to create a lot of uncertainty across the whole industry right now.
Okay, Jennifer Lagrassa, thank you for that. Really appreciate getting the news from on the ground where there's already been an impact. Thank you. We'll come back to you if we need to. And I'll bring back David Cochrane here. It was interesting, David, that the Liberal leader also said that he visited that very plant when he was in Windsor last week trying to, when he announced, I believe, that $2 billion fund for the auto sector to try and help them if they kept their goods and their business inside the country. This is a tiny sliver of the damage being done to the Canadian economy in the short term. This is going to be much bigger and much broader. And you even heard Mark Carney talk about how he believes that in the auto sector in particular, the United States will quickly find out that the competitive advantage of having an integrated sector will come crashing down pretty hard on the United States.
Yeah, and it will cost jobs, and it will cost profits and shareholder value on both sides. But there is an acute vulnerability on the Canadian side of the border in terms of the job losses, right? Like this one, like I got Lana Payne on the phone very quickly before we started this special at 11 o'clock today. She's the national president of Unifor, and I was asking her about walk me through the implications of what's happening here in Windsor, and she said there's those direct jobs, but then there's all the other plants that feed into it, right? So this is the supply chain. And there's potentially a knock-on effect of thousands more of people who could, either have a reduction in hours or a loss of employment, at least temporarily and maybe permanently, depending on how this goes. Because you have in these integrated supply chains parts that are made on both sides of the border and fly back and forth all the time without tariff. But in some cases, there's a duplication in production that sort of a part is made in Canada, but might also be made in the United States. The big concern is that these tariffs, the automakers just say, well, we're just going to source it all from the U.S. side. So that plant that makes this specific part, gets choked out by these tariffs. And so that's just sort of the Canadian context. The bigger global context, right, where Mark Carney talks about how the U.S. is pulling back from its leadership in the world. When you look at just the haphazard way these tariffs were done, the percentages that were imposed, it's done through this rough calculation of trade deficits and exports that
nothing
really
to do with reciprocity.
No, it's not reciprocal. It's a very crude measurement. And just to give you an example of there's 20% on the European Union, 10% on the United Kingdom, but this is how haphazard it is. The Heard and McDonald Islands, which are in Australian territory, they have a tariff slapped on them. Nobody lives on those islands. There is no industry. It is solely inhabited by penguins. So what kind of thought process went into this? The French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the south coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, it's a French colony. They're slapped with a 50% tariff. There's 5,800 people there. It is not an export and manufacturing hub. So the crudeness of the calculations, it's also part of France. So why would its tariff be 2.5 times higher than what France gets as a member of the European Union? So the logic of this is non-existent, is the best way I can explain it. But the disruptive impact of all of this is absolutely enormous, that it seems quite likely you're going to have a massive slowdown in global trade that could lead to a global recession. And, it's been 95 years since Herbert Hoover and his Congress brought in the Smoot-Hawley tariffs to try to deal with a recession, and it worked so well it turned into the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And there's a similar policy being pursued here.
Yeah, and to say nothing of, you talked about Windsor, and those are the people directly affected in a temporary basis, but obviously those people then have less money to spend, less places to go, and it has a sort of knock-on effect around the local economy and community as well. And to that end, I want to bring in James Stewart. He's the president of Unifor Local 444. That is indeed the Stellantis plant where people have been affected today. James, thank you for making the time. I'm sure it's a very challenging day for you and people in the plant.
Good afternoon. It certainly is. They've announced this temporary shuttering of the plant for a couple of weeks. They've also told us that they expect changes to the schedule beyond those 2 weeks after they reassess. There had been rumors around Windsor and around our plant about some downtime coming. But when they called us into a meeting last night, Lana Payne, myself, along with leadership from the plant and the National Union, they were pretty clear with us that there was a numerous factors going into this, but the direct result of the announcement yesterday afternoon by Donald Trump about the tariffs, and then the COO of Stellantis sent out a message today saying there were plants being temporarily shut down in Canada, Mexico, and ultimately that will affect some of the plants in the United States as well, in his message based on the tariffs and how they're going to assess these moving forward.
So it's 3,200 people in your plant, a plant that has only, I think, 4,000, right? So there's not a lot of people who are going to be still working.
We have 4,500 at the Windsor Assembly Plant. This about 4,000 of them.
Okay.
And then you'll have the whole feeder system. So we have, five tier 1 suppliers right here in Windsor. You have a whole host of second, third tier suppliers, both unionized and non-unionized, both in the States, Canada, and Mexico, that will all be affected. So there'll be, maybe a factor of 8 on that 4,000.
So James, let me get your best guess then on whether this pause in work will continue, because if the tariffs continue at this magnitude, it seems hard to imagine that all auto plant sectors and manufacturing sectors can continue to function. Do you think that this is going to be a longer work stoppage than what you've been told?
I think potentially. It's hard to know. I know that the United States has come out and said all foreign vehicles are being taxed at 25%. CUSMA or USMCA qualified vehicles will only be taxed, and this isn't yet, but only be taxed on the non-U.S. portion of the vehicle. That's going to take quite a long time to figure out. And they're also saying come May 3rd or May 4th that parts, whether they're CUSMA related or not. Right now, any CUSMA related part isn't being tariffed, but come May 3rd, that will change. And I really think that has the potential to shut the industry down.
You said their job losses would be multiplied by a factor of 8. Did I hear that correctly? And so what would you
for every direct job in the plant, it's about 8 members or people that build to feed the plant for every member of the assembly plant. We're a plant to build. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, James, I don't know if you heard Prime Minister Carney talk about the response, which will be a 25% reciprocal counter tariff, worth about $8 billion, and that all of that money will be fed back into the auto industry to support workers. Is that encouraging to you? How concerned are you about what people are going to need in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, I'm concerned. I think that's the right decision. Any tariffs that are raised have to go to the people that are going to be affected by this. Tax breaks mean nothing if you don't have a job. If you're not making income because your job's gone, a tax break means nothing to you. So I think it's got to go into, at least in the short term, to address to make sure the economy is still running, to make sure people are still feeding their families. Sure. The worker of the plant can't fix this. So I think that's the right call. But I think more needs to be done over the coming weeks to really work towards resolving this whole issue.
Can you give me a sense of what kind of salaries people make in that particular plant versus sort of what they will get in terms of employment insurance, at least in this short term?
So, with employment insurance and the assembly plant has a supplementary unemployment benefit. It's in around 65 to 70% of their wages. The feeder system, which is much larger, they don't have any of that. They've got EI somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% or 50% of their wages. Most will have a hard time getting through this.
Are people angry, the people that you're talking to, or are they sad? Like, how are they feeling? I mean, obviously they knew it was coming. Something was coming. Yeah.
It's right. We're a border town, so it's for us. It's a little bit more personal. We live part of our lives crossing the U.S. border because you look across the river and there's Detroit. We're people have joked that we're a suburb of Detroit for a long time. So we're really interconnected. We go there for sports events. We go there for concerts. We go there for dinner with our families. We have family back and forth. So really, we know it's not the people in the United States. It's their government, but there's a real sense of betrayal. We've been a number one trading partner and ally for the U.S. For as long as anyone can remember. And it's certainly, it's unjustified. Everyone knows it's unjustified. Our trade balance in autos is almost near perfect. For every car we sell to the United States, we buy one from the United States and Canada. It's a near perfect balance. We're not a sector or a jurisdiction that's low pay where the U.S. has lost jobs to. We're a good paying sector with good health healthcare and benefits that have been bargained for, and even non-union places supply the same or provide the same benefits because that's just the way it works. We have high standards of health and safety legislation and safety in the plant. So this is not the jurisdiction that the United States loses jobs to. And it's an unjust attack on us, really.
I'll just end on this, James. Obviously, there's a federal election happening, and this has become, part of the conversation or the conversation of the election campaign. What would you like political leaders to know right now that in terms of what your workers and your friends are thinking about and what they need right now?
That's tough. I think all levels of government need to be working towards, standing up for Canada. First of all, putting this partisanship behind them in the face of what's being done with Canada. We do have to diversify our economy, but in auto, it's the Americans that buy our vehicles, and we buy most of our vehicles from Americans. So we have to keep working to resolving the issues with the United States. We can say, I can sit here and scream from the top of my lungs that it's unjust, but at the end of the day, that's the government we're dealing with in the United States, and we have to find ways to eliminate these tariffs. We have to find ways to look after the workers that are being affected. And that's going to take some tough decisions by our government. We have to respond strongly. We have to defend Canada, all with the interest of resolving the issues in the long term.
Okay, James Stewart, president of Unifor Local 444 in Windsor there. Sorry you're having such a tough day, but really important to hear from you and get a perspective about people who are feeling this right away. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to bring in now Josh McJanet. He's the co-founder of Dominion City Brewing Company. He has partnered with 40 other breweries to release a beer that's 100% Canadian, but you are directly affected by the tariffs on aluminum, I would imagine, Josh. No reprieve for you. How is this affecting your bottom line?
Yeah, everything that's happening at the moment is making things harder, and needlessly harder. And I think we're all wrapping our brains around that still. But, you alluded to the campaign Glorious and Free that we've come up with breweries from coast to coast to coast. And honestly, I think these days, I don't want to wake up wondering what's happening in an office in Washington, D.C. and how it affects my business. I just want to do what little I can do to control what I control. And I think your last guest sort of alluded to the same thing. And I think that's what governments are grappling with, too.
So what can you control then here? Because if I understand correctly, with aluminum, it is rolled and then sent to the United States and then sent back to you. So what piece of this can you control? Is there a way to source what you need inside the country?
Yeah, actually, we don't make the standard beer can that you would find for a craft brewery like ours would be a 473 ml tall can. No one makes them in Canada. We make some short cans, but a lot of these assumptions that underpin what you could count on and where you would source from and what it was worth to pay a premium for, we're reevaluating a lot of those things as a country and even just here as a small business. We're doing more of that faster than at any time in the 10 years that we've been running our little business. And I think we're going to have to continue doing it hard and fast.
And so what does that mean in terms of costs for your business? Are your margins getting smaller? Are you having to pass on costs to consumers?
Yeah, in our case, we had a sense that this was coming. We deliberately stocked up on inventory, like cans, before some of these price hikes. But we're going to run out of runway. There's no question that if this goes on for any length of time, we will be facing higher costs. We're already priced at a premium and really don't feel like we have the ability to just pass on significant price hikes. We're racing to invest in our business to become more efficient and to be able to make a quality product as cost effectively as possible. But it is really, really hard right now. But I think beyond that, there's sort of the challenges just running our business. Beer has a sense of just sort of always being ingratiated in the communities in which we operate. And so I think we're also just mindful that our community is going to be facing a really hard time as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Josh McJanet, thank you for making the time. I appreciate you giving us your perspective here in Ottawa. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to bring back Katie Nicholson in Washington. Just get a last thought from you, Katie, about what you're watching for from the White House today. Obviously, we don't expect any change in policy stance, but anything else that we're expecting in terms of explanation from the Oval?
Honestly, I'm entirely expecting to stay on this message track. It's been very strong throughout the day. Really, again, urging people to stay on board, thinking about the long-term sort of goals that they're trying to set here of bringing in manufacturing here, that protectionist attitude. There's a lot of swagger. This is what they're doubling down on right now, and that is, they've been doing it, pretty much in the face of all of the anger from the EU, the tough words coming out of China as well, and really what Howard Lutnick said today is that do not expect him to blink. This is not something that they're going to back away from. So the only other thing that I'm really keeping an eye on is Truth Social, just to see if there is going to be any kind of statement from the White House, or if indeed the president is going to have to say anything about Canada's own auto tariff sort of tit for tat.
Okay. Katie Nicholson in Washington, D.C., thank you. I appreciate you being with us. I think Kate McKenna is with us as well. I'm going to go back to Kate McKenna she had to go. All right, I'll just ask her in the newsroom for her last thought. Last thought to you. I mean, it is when you put some real people who are experiencing the immediate real impacts of this, it starts to get, palpable in terms of what we are possibly dealing with here. This is going to hurt, even if it is not as bad as we expected or thought, or as bad as other people. It is going to be painful for some people in some sectors, and it's starting already.
The factor of 8. Right.
Yes,
from Unifor 444, I mean, 3,000 jobs, 4,000 jobs directly, you're talking 32,000 jobs indirectly, the ripple effect throughout this, affected in some way, not necessarily lost, but affected by this. Listening to Josh McJanet with Dominion City Brewery, if this keeps up, there may be no price too high for a beer, as people struggle to cope with this. But I go back to what Mark Carney said about the change in the relationship with the United States. And whatever happens for the rest of this election, what are the areas of common ground when the goals in the United States are disruption and dominance, right? That the only way to measure wins is how much you take from other people, viewing everyone as a supplier and a customer, not a partner, certainly not a competitor. And it's all driven by this adoration of an industrial policy that really is from the last century, using trade policy that's from the 19th century. It is, U.S. leadership on the expansion of free trade and the rules-based world order that has been so central post-World War II is just turned on its head. And when people talk about China and non-market economies being the big threat to global trade, the United States has just moved into that because it's operating like a non-market economy now. It is just arbitrarily, it's fiat from the Oval Office that is disrupting how the world does business.
David Cochrane, thank you. David, of course, we'll be back at 5 o'clock. I think 5 o'clock, unless
5 o'clock, unless it's earlier.
For Power Politics tonight, where he'll have lots of analysis and coverage of this. Of course, what Mark Carney announced today, counter tariffs of 25% in the Canadian auto sector to respond to what the president went ahead with yesterday. This will, of course, continue to be a central question of the election campaign as it continues for the next number of weeks. A dramatic moment in Canadian history on the Canadian economy. Lots to think about. More coverage here on CBC News Network. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks for watching.